Tonight, you're about to experience something extraordinary that Zen masters have quietly shared for over 1,000 years. A collection of profound stories that possess an almost magical ability to dissolve anxiety and guide your mind into perfect stillness. I'm going to share 16 timeless Zen tales that have transformed countless lives, each one carefully chosen to unlock a different door in your consciousness and lead you gently toward the deepest rest you've ever known. These aren't just bedtime stories. They're ancient keys that open pathways to inner peace your mind has been searching for. Whether you're carrying the weight of tomorrow's worries, replaying today's conversations, or simply feeling that familiar restlessness that keeps sleep just out of reach, these teachings will meet you exactly where you are. What makes this journey special is its gentleness. You don't need to understand Buddhism or have any meditation experience. The Buddha taught that wisdom reveals itself naturally when we simply listen with an open heart. Tonight, as we explore tales of samurai discovering paradise, monks learning true silence, and masters revealing the most valuable treasures, you'll feel something shifting deep within you. Your breathing will naturally slow, your shoulders will release tension you didn't know you were holding, and gradually, effortlessly, you'll find yourself drifting toward that perfect place where thoughts dissolve and peace begins. So settle in completely now. Let your body sink into comfort. Take a gentle breath with me. And as you exhale, trust that this ancient wisdom is already beginning its quiet work. Our first story is about the thin boundary between heaven and hell within our own hearts. This is the tale of the soldier and the gates of paradise. In ancient Japan, when cherry blossoms painted the mountainsides pink and white, a fierce samurai warrior named Nobushiga made his way up a winding stone path to visit the renowned Zen master Hakuin. The monastery bells echoed softly through the valley as morning mist clung to the pine trees. Nobushiga carried himself with the rigid bearing of a professional soldier, his hand resting naturally on the hilt of his katana, his eyes alert and calculating. The warrior entered the simple temple where Master Hakuin sat in quiet meditation. When the old teacher opened his eyes and gazed upon his visitor, Nobushiga bowed briefly and spoke with military directness. "Master, I have come to ask you about something that troubles me. Is there really a paradise and a hell? I have heard many teachings, but I want to know the truth." Hakuin studied the samurai for a long moment, taking in his proud posture and stern expression. "Who are you?" the master inquired gently. "I am a samurai," Nobushiga replied, his chest swelling with pride. "I serve my lord with honor and am prepared to die for my country." Suddenly, Hakuin's demeanor changed completely. "You, a soldier!" he exclaimed with apparent disgust. "What kind of ruler would have you as his guard? Your face looks like that of a beggar, not a warrior worthy of respect." The insult struck Nobushige like a physical blow. His face flushed red with rage, and his hand moved instinctively toward his sword. How dare this old monk speak to him with such disrespect? But Hakuin continued his verbal assault. "So you have a sword. Your weapon is probably much too dull to cut off my head. I doubt you could cut through rice paper with such a pathetic blade." The samurai's anger exploded beyond all control. He drew his sword with a fierce cry, raising it above his head, ready to strike down this insolent teacher who had insulted his honor so grievously. At that precise moment, as fury consumed every fiber of Nobushiga's being, Hakuin spoke calmly. "Here open the gates of hell." The words struck through the warrior's rage like lightning through darkness. In an instant, Nobushiga saw clearly what had happened. He perceived the master's profound teaching method and understood that his own anger had indeed opened the gates of hell within his own heart. The realization was so powerful that he immediately sheathed his sword and bowed deeply before the teacher. "Here open the gates of paradise," said Hakuin with infinite gentleness. The Buddha taught, "Holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned." This ancient wisdom reveals the profound truth that Nobushiga discovered in that transformative moment, that heaven and hell are not distant destinations, but immediate experiences created by the state of our own consciousness. Why do we so readily open the gates of hell within ourselves? Zen Buddhism points to several aspects of human psychology that create this pattern. First is our attachment to self-image and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Nobushige identified so completely with being a respectable samurai that any challenge to this identity triggered explosive defensiveness. When someone threatens our carefully constructed sense of self, we instinctively reach for the sword of anger, righteous indignation, or wounded pride. Second is our conditioned response to treat every perceived slight as a genuine threat requiring immediate defensive action. Our ancient survival mechanisms haven't adapted to modern social situations where physical aggression is rarely appropriate. The same neurological pathways that once helped us escape predators now fire when someone cuts us off in traffic, criticizes our work, or fails to show us what we consider adequate respect. Third is our fundamental misunderstanding about the source of our emotional experience. We believe that others make us angry, when in reality, anger arises from our own interpretations and reactions. Hakuin didn't create Nobushiga's hell. He simply revealed the hell that the samurai carried within himself, ready to be triggered by the right circumstances. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, "When another person makes you suffer, it is because he suffers deeply within himself, and his suffering is spilling over. He does not need punishment. He needs help." This wisdom applies equally to our own angry reactions. When we find ourselves opening the gates of hell, it's often because some unhealed suffering within us has been touched. Consider the last time someone's words or actions triggered intense anger in you. Perhaps a colleague dismissed your ideas in a meeting, a family member criticized your choices, or a stranger was rude to you in public. In that moment, what gates opened within your consciousness? Did you feel the familiar rush of righteous fury, the desire to defend yourself or strike back? These are the gates of hell opening, not because the other person was necessarily wrong, but because your own inner peace was so fragile that it could be shattered by external circumstances. The Buddha said, "You will not be punished for your anger. You will be punished by your anger." This punishment is immediate and internal. When we're consumed by rage, we suffer far more than our supposed enemies. Our bodies flood with stress hormones. Our thinking becomes clouded. Our relationships suffer, and we lose access to our natural wisdom and compassion. But Hakuin's teaching reveals something even more profound. The same circumstances that can open hell's gates can instantly open paradise's gates when met with awareness rather than reactivity. The moment Nobushiga recognized what was happening within his own mind, his entire experience transformed. The angry warrior became a humble student, the threatening situation became a profound teaching, and the gates of paradise swung open. This is the miracle of mindfulness, the capacity to observe our mental and emotional states as they arise without being completely identified with them. When we can see our anger clearly, we gain the power to choose our response rather than being enslaved by automatic reactions. In Zen practice, we cultivate what might be called emotional intelligence, not the suppression of feelings, but the development of a spacious awareness that can hold all experiences with equanimity. We learn to notice the early warning signs of hell's gates beginning to open, the tightening in the chest, the heat rising in the face, the rush of defensive thoughts. With practice, we can catch these patterns before they consume us completely. Tonight, as you reflect on your own triggers and reactive patterns, can you identify the circumstances that most reliably open hell's gates within your consciousness? Perhaps it's feeling unappreciated, being interrupted, having your competence questioned, or being treated with disrespect. These triggers are actually doorways to freedom when approached with awareness rather than automatic reaction. As the Buddha taught, better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. In our daily interactions, we have countless opportunities to choose which gates we open, not just for ourselves, but for others. When we respond to aggression with patience, to criticism with curiosity, and to disrespect with dignity, we help create conditions where paradise's gates can open for everyone involved. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a tale that reveals how conventional thinking can blind us to creative solutions. This is the story of arresting the stone Buddha. On a sweltering summer day in ancient Japan, when the cicadas sang their relentless chorus and the air shimmered with heat, a weary merchant made his way along the dusty road leading to the marketplace. Across his broad shoulders, he carried 50 rolls of finest cotton goods, his entire inventory and the foundation of his family's livelihood. The weight pressed down upon him as sweat beaded on his forehead and his legs grew heavy with fatigue. Seeing a roadside shelter ahead, the merchant felt profound relief wash over him. There, beneath a simple wooden roof, stood a magnificent stone Buddha, carved with exquisite detail and weathered by countless seasons. The statue's serene expression seemed to offer refuge from both the blazing sun and the burdens of commerce. Gratefully, the merchant set down his precious cotton rolls at the Buddha's feet and settled into the cool shade. The peaceful presence of the statue, combined with his exhaustion, soon lulled him into deep sleep. His breathing became slow and regular as his body finally released the tension of the long journey. When he awoke hours later, the merchant's blood ran cold. His 50 rolls of cotton had vanished completely. He searched frantically around the shelter, hoping perhaps they had simply been moved by a helpful passerby, but found nothing. His life's work had disappeared while he slept under the supposed protection of the enlightened one. Devastated and desperate, the merchant hurried to the local magistrate's office to report the theft. The case came before Judge Ooka, a man renowned throughout the region for his unconventional wisdom and creative approach to justice. When the merchant finished explaining his loss, the judge sat quietly for several long moments, stroking his beard thoughtfully. Finally, Judge Ooka announced his verdict with complete seriousness. That stone Buddha must have stolen the goods. He is supposed to care for the welfare of the people, but he has clearly failed to perform his holy duty. The Buddha will be arrested immediately. The court officials exchanged bewildered glances, but the judge's authority was absolute. Following his orders, they went to the roadside shelter and, with great ceremony, arrested the stone statue. They carried the heavy Buddha into the courthouse, where word of this extraordinary event had already spread throughout the town. A large, noisy crowd gathered, laughing and joking about the absurdity of putting a stone statue on trial. The people found great entertainment in this unprecedented legal proceeding, chattering excitedly among themselves as they waited to see what would happen next. When Judge Ooka entered the courtroom and took his place on the bench, his expression was stern and disapproving. He surveyed the boisterous crowd with obvious displeasure before speaking. "What right have you people to appear before this court laughing and joking in such a manner?" he demanded. "This is a serious legal proceeding, and your behavior shows complete contempt for the dignity of justice. You are all in contempt of court and subject to significant fines and imprisonment." The laughter died immediately. The crowd grew silent and nervous, suddenly realizing they might face real consequences for their amusement. "I shall have to impose a fine on each of you," the judge continued gravely, "but I am prepared to show mercy. The fine will be remitted provided each person brings 1 roll of cotton goods to this court within 3 days. Anyone failing to do this will be arrested and face the full penalty of the law." The people, now thoroughly sobered by the prospect of legal punishment, hastily agreed to the judge's terms. Over the next 3 days, they brought cotton rolls from their homes, shops, and storage rooms, eager to avoid the threatened consequences. When all the rolls had been collected, the merchant was asked to examine them carefully. Almost immediately, he recognized one particular roll as unmistakably his own. He knew its texture, weave, and distinctive markings intimately. Following this thread, the authorities quickly identified the thief, who had been forced to bring the stolen goods to court under the judge's clever scheme. The merchant recovered his property, the cotton rolls were returned to their rightful owners, and justice was served through the most unconventional of methods. The stone Buddha, having served its purpose in the investigation, was quietly returned to its roadside post, where it resumed its eternal vigil with the same serene expression. The Buddha taught, 3 things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. This teaching illuminates the profound wisdom embedded in Judge Ooka's unconventional approach. Sometimes, the direct path to truth requires abandoning conventional thinking and embracing seemingly absurd methods that reveal deeper realities. Why do we so often get trapped in rigid, conventional approaches to complex problems? Zen Buddhism identifies several mental habits that limit our creative problem-solving abilities. First is our attachment to logical sequence and conventional cause and effect thinking. We expect problems to be solved through direct, linear approaches. If something is stolen, we investigate suspects, gather evidence, and build a case. Judge Ooka's method appeared completely illogical, yet it worked more effectively than traditional investigation. Second is our fear of appearing foolish or unconventional. Most judges would never risk their reputation by arresting a stone statue, regardless of how effective such an approach might prove. Our concern with maintaining dignity and following established procedures often prevents us from discovering innovative solutions to persistent problems. Third is our tendency to overlook the power of indirect action. Zen teaches that the most direct path is sometimes the most circuitous one. By creating an apparently absurd situation, Judge Ooka generated the exact conditions needed to solve the crime. The community's laughter and perceived superiority over the foolish legal system became the very mechanism that exposed the truth. Consider situations in your own life where conventional approaches have failed to resolve persistent challenges. Perhaps you've tried repeatedly to have a difficult conversation with a family member through direct confrontation, only to encounter resistance and defensiveness. Maybe you've struggled with a work problem using standard methods that simply aren't yielding results. Or you might be stuck in a pattern of thinking about a personal issue that keeps leading to the same frustrating conclusions. Zen master Suzuki Roshi taught, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few." This beginner's mind allows us to see situations with fresh eyes, unencumbered by assumptions about how things should work. Judge Ooka approached the theft with beginner's mind, setting aside conventional judicial procedures to focus on the essential question: how can the truth be revealed? The Buddha said, "The mind is everything, what you think you become." When our minds are locked into rigid patterns of thinking, we become rigid in our responses to life's challenges. But when we cultivate mental flexibility and creative openness, we become capable of discovering unexpected solutions. The story also reveals something profound about the nature of community and shared responsibility. The townspeople initially felt superior to the legal process, laughing at what seemed like judicial foolishness, but their amusement was transformed into participation when they faced personal consequences. This mirrors how we often remain detached from problems until we recognize our own stake in finding solutions. Tonight, as you consider the challenges currently facing you, can you imagine approaching them with Judge Ooka's creative unconventionality? What would it look like to arrest the stone Buddha in your situation? To take an action that seems absurd on the surface, but might create conditions for truth to emerge? Perhaps instead of confronting a difficult person directly, you might try approaching them indirectly through shared activities or mutual friends. Maybe instead of forcing a decision, you might create circumstances that allow the right choice to become obvious. As the Buddha taught, if you want to know your past, look at your present. If you want to know your future, look at your present actions. Sometimes the most effective present action is the one that appears least logical, but creates the most authentic conditions for wisdom to manifest. Now, let us explore a story about the true nature of service and the hierarchy of values that guide our lives. This is the tale of the soldiers of humanity. During a time when military exercises filled the Japanese countryside with the sounds of marching feet and shouted commands, a division of the Imperial Army found itself conducting training maneuvers in the mountains near Zen Master Gassen's temple. The mock battle required several days to complete, and the commanding officers, seeking suitable accommodations for their headquarters, approached the simple mountain monastery where Gassen resided with his small community of monks. The temple, built of weathered wood and surrounded by ancient pine trees, offered an atmosphere of profound tranquility that stood in stark contrast to the martial energy of the soldiers. Morning mist often clung to the temple grounds, where the gentle sound of a bamboo fountain and the soft chanting of sutras created a sanctuary of peace. When the military officers arrived at the temple gates, they expected the deferential treatment typically accorded to representatives of the emperor's army. Throughout Japan, civilians routinely offered their finest accommodations, best food, and most respectful service to soldiers who sacrificed for the nation's protection. Master Gassan received the officers politely, but without any special ceremony. He simply informed them that they were welcome to stay at the temple during their exercises. However, when the first meal was served, the visiting officers were surprised and then increasingly irritated to discover they were being offered the same simple vegetarian fare that the monks ate daily: plain rice, pickled vegetables, thin soup, and weak tea. The military men had expected elaborate meals befitting their status and importance. As representatives of imperial power engaged in vital training exercises, they felt entitled to the finest food the temple could provide. Their frustration grew throughout the day as they realized this would be their standard fare for the duration of their stay. Finally, one of the senior officers, his patience exhausted, approached Master Gassan directly. His uniform was pressed and decorated with insignia denoting rank and service. His bearing was rigid with military pride and barely controlled indignation. "Master," he said, attempting to maintain respectful tone while his anger was clearly visible, "I must speak with you about our treatment here. Who do you think we are? We are soldiers of the imperial army, sacrificing our lives for our country and our emperor. We risk everything in service to Japan. Why don't you treat us accordingly? Why do you offer us the same plain food you give to your monks?" The officer expected an immediate apology and correction of what he saw as a clear oversight or insult. Surely the old monk had simply failed to understand the importance of his guests and would quickly rectify the situation once properly informed. But Master Gassan's response was not what the officer anticipated. The Zen teacher looked directly into the soldier's eyes with unwavering calm and spoke with gentle but absolute conviction. "Who do you think we are? We are soldiers of humanity, aiming to save all sentient beings." The officer stood speechless, his prepared arguments suddenly seeming insignificant in the face of this unexpected response. The master's words carried such quiet authority and profound purpose that the complaint about food seemed petty and self-centered by comparison. Gassan continued, his voice remaining soft but filled with unmistakable strength. "You fight for one nation, for one emperor, for temporary political arrangements that will pass away like morning dew. We fight for all beings, for the liberation of every form of consciousness from suffering. Your battlefield is limited by geography and time. Our battlefield is the human heart itself, and our mission extends across lifetimes." The officer found himself reconsidering not just the quality of temple meals, but the entire framework through which he understood service, sacrifice, and spiritual priorities. The Buddha taught, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. This teaching reveals the profound difference between conventional warfare and the spiritual battle that Master Gassan described. While military action often seeks to overcome enemies through superior force, the path of Dharma seeks to transform enemies into allies through the power of compassion and understanding. Why do we so readily assume that our particular form of service deserves special recognition and privilege? Buddhism points to several aspects of ego identification that create this pattern. First is our tendency to define ourselves through external roles and titles, rather than through our essential Buddha nature. The officer identified so completely with being a soldier that he expected the world to reflect back this identity through preferential treatment. Second is our habit of creating hierarchies of importance based on social recognition rather than spiritual value. Society teaches us that certain roles, soldier, doctor, teacher, parent, deserve more respect than others. But from the Buddhist perspective, the value of any activity depends entirely on the motivation behind it and its effect on reducing universal suffering. Third is our limited understanding of what constitutes genuine sacrifice and service. The officers saw their military training as the ultimate form of service, risking personal safety for national protection. But Gassan revealed a higher form of service, the complete dedication of one's life to the spiritual welfare of all beings, without exception or preference. Zen Master Dogen taught, "To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things." This forgetting of the limited self allows us to recognize our fundamental interconnection with all life. When we truly understand this interconnection, service becomes not a matter of duty or recognition, but a natural expression of our enlightened nature. Consider the various roles you play in your daily life and the expectations you carry about how others should respond to these roles. Perhaps you expect your children to be grateful for your parental sacrifices, your employer to acknowledge your professional contributions, or your community to recognize your volunteer efforts. These expectations often create frustration when others don't offer the appreciation we feel we deserve. The Buddha said, "If you truly loved yourself, you would never harm yourself with harmful acts." Most people harm themselves by their own negative thoughts and actions. This harm often comes from tying our self-worth to external recognition rather than to the intrinsic value of loving service itself. Master Gassan's response reveals something profound about authentic spiritual authority. He didn't need to defend his position or justify his treatment of the officers. His authority came not from institutional position, but from the depth of his compassion and the breadth of his vision. When we serve from this place of genuine love for all beings, external recognition becomes irrelevant because the service itself is its own reward. The story also illuminates different levels of consciousness regarding service and sacrifice. Military service operates from dualistic thinking, us versus them, our country versus their country, victory versus defeat. Spiritual service operates from non-dualistic awareness, the recognition that the welfare of all beings is ultimately inseparable from our own welfare. This doesn't diminish the value of conventional forms of service, but rather places them in a larger context. A soldier who serves with genuine compassion for all beings, including supposed enemies, transforms military service into spiritual practice. A parent who raises children with awareness of their connection to all life serves not just their own family, but the entire human community. Tonight, as you reflect on your own forms of service and the recognition you seek for them, can you expand your vision to include Master Gassan's perspective? What would it mean to see yourself as a soldier of humanity, regardless of your official role or title? How might this shift change your expectations about appreciation and acknowledgement? As the Buddha taught, Thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared. When we serve from this understanding, we discover that true fulfillment comes not from being recognized as special, but from recognizing the specialness in everyone we encounter. Let us continue on our journey with a story that reveals the paradox of knowledge and the humility required for genuine understanding. This is the tale of Gudo and the Emperor. In the imperial palace of ancient Japan, where silk screens painted with cranes and cherry blossoms filtered the golden afternoon light, Emperor Goyose found himself drawn increasingly to the profound teachings of Zen Buddhism. Despite having access to the greatest scholars and philosophers in the land, the emperor felt a persistent longing for understanding that conventional learning could not satisfy. The emperor had heard of a remarkable Zen master named Gudo, whose reputation for wisdom and directness had spread throughout the realm. Unlike many teachers who spoke in elaborate metaphors or complex philosophical systems, Gudo was known for his ability to point directly to truth with startling simplicity and clarity. Arranging for private instruction, Emperor Goyose began studying with Master Gudo in a quiet chamber of the palace. The room was simple despite its royal setting: tatami mats, a low table, and cushions for meditation. Here, the most powerful man in Japan sat as a humble student before an elderly monk who owned nothing but his robes and begging bowl. During one of their sessions, the emperor raised a question that had been troubling him deeply. "Master Gudo," he said, "I have been studying the fundamental teachings of Zen, and I have learned that this very mind is Buddha. Is this understanding correct?" The emperor expected either confirmation of his comprehension or correction of his error. Instead, Gudo's response revealed the inadequacy of such simple categories. "Your Majesty," Gudo replied with gentle directness, "if I say yes, you will think that you understand without truly understanding. If I say no, I would be contradicting a fact which you may actually understand quite well." The emperor sat with this puzzling response, recognizing that his question had been more complex than he initially realized. There was something in Gudo's answer that pointed to a level of understanding beyond intellectual agreement or disagreement. On another occasion, the emperor posed what he considered an even more profound inquiry. "Master, where does the enlightened man go when he dies? What becomes of one who has achieved perfect understanding?" Again, Gudo's answer was unexpected in its simplicity. "I know not." The emperor was startled. How could this renowned master, this teacher of teachers, admit to such fundamental ignorance about something so important? "Master, why don't you know?" the emperor pressed. "Surely someone of your understanding must have insight into such matters." Gudo's response was even more disarming than his admission of ignorance. "Because I have not died yet." The emperor felt his mind reeling. Here was honesty so complete, so free from pretense or speculation, that it challenged everything he thought he understood about knowledge and spiritual authority. The master's willingness to admit the limits of his direct experience was more profound than any elaborate theory about afterlife states. Emperor Goyose found himself hesitating to ask further questions. His rational mind could not grasp these responses that seemed to dissolve the very foundation of conventional inquiry. He sat in confused silence, uncertain how to proceed with a teacher who answered questions by revealing their inadequacy. Suddenly, Gudo struck the floor sharply with his hand, the sound cracking through the quiet chamber like thunder. The unexpected noise shattered the emperor's mental confusion, and in that moment of startled awareness, understanding flashed through his consciousness like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. The emperor was enlightened. In that instant, he understood what could not be understood through thinking, grasped what could not be grasped through concepts, and knew what could not be known through intellectual analysis. The awakening was immediate, complete, and undeniable. From that moment forward, Emperor Goyose's respect for Zen Buddhism and for Old Master Gudo deepened immeasurably. He had discovered through direct experience what no amount of study could have taught him: that ultimate reality is not something to be understood, but something to be realized through immediate awareness. Years passed, and Master Gudo grew very old. During his lectures in the palace, the ancient teacher would sometimes fall asleep in the middle of speaking, overcome by the fatigue of his aging body. When this happened, the emperor would quietly retire to another room, ensuring that his beloved teacher could rest undisturbed, without embarrassment or concern for protocol. The Buddha taught, "Do not believe in anything simply because you have heard it. Do not believe in anything simply because it is spoken and rumored by many. But after observation and analysis, when you find that anything agrees with reason and is conducive to the good and benefit of one and all, then accept it and live up to it." This teaching reveals the profound difference between intellectual knowledge and direct realization that lies at the heart of Gudo's instruction. The emperor initially approached Zen study as he might approach any scholarly subject, seeking information that could be grasped, categorized, and stored in memory. But enlightenment is not information, it is transformation. Why do we so persistently confuse knowing about something with knowing something directly? Buddhism identifies several obstacles to genuine understanding. First is our attachment to conceptual thinking as the primary means of apprehending reality. We've been conditioned to believe that if we can think clearly about something, we understand it. But the deepest truths of existence cannot be captured in concepts, no matter how sophisticated our thinking becomes. Second is our desire for certainty and our discomfort with not knowing. The emperor wanted definitive answers about Buddha nature and enlightened death, because uncertainty feels threatening to the ego mind. But Gudo revealed that true wisdom often begins with genuine acknowledgement of the limits of conceptual knowledge. Third is our tendency to seek spiritual understanding through the same methods we use to acquire ordinary knowledge: accumulating information, building theories, and organizing concepts into systematic frameworks. But enlightenment is not the culmination of learning. It is the recognition of what has always been present, but obscured by the very effort to grasp it intellectually. Zen Master Huangpo taught, "The foolish reject what they see, not what they think. The wise reject what they think, not what they see." This points to the fundamental shift that occurred when Gudo struck the floor. The emperor stopped trying to think his way to understanding and instead experienced direct awareness without the mediation of concepts. Consider your own relationship to uncertainty and not knowing. How comfortable are you with admitting, "I don't know," when asked about important matters? Our educational and professional systems often reward confident answers and penalize acknowledged ignorance, creating a culture where not knowing feels like failure rather than wisdom. The Buddha said, "It is better to travel well than to arrive." The journey of spiritual inquiry is more valuable than reaching definitive conclusions. because the journey itself transforms our relationship to knowing and not knowing. When we can rest comfortably in uncertainty, we become available to insights that lie beyond the reach of conceptual understanding. Gudo's teaching method reveals something profound about authentic spiritual authority. Rather than claiming special knowledge or offering impressive theories, he demonstrated the humility of genuine wisdom. His power as a teacher came not from what he knew, but from his complete honesty about what he didn't know. This honesty created space for the emperor's own direct realization to emerge. The story also illustrates the transformative power of immediate presence. When Gudo struck the floor, he wasn't providing information or explanation. He was creating a moment of shock that interrupted the emperor's conceptual processing and allowed direct awareness to manifest. This points to the inadequacy of purely verbal teaching and the importance of experiential methods in spiritual development. Tonight, as you contemplate the questions that most deeply concern you about meaning, purpose, love, death, or ultimate reality, can you rest in not knowing rather than grasping for premature answers? What would it feel like to approach these mysteries with Gudo's honest acknowledgement of the limits of conceptual understanding? As the Buddha taught, the wise find pleasure in water, warriors find pleasure in swords, kings find pleasure in kingdoms, fools find pleasure in arguments, but the enlightened find pleasure in meditation. This pleasure in meditation is the pleasure of resting in direct awareness itself, beyond the need to know or understand anything at all. Our next story speaks to the wisdom of understanding the difference between fate and skillful action. This is the tale of the warrior and the coin of destiny. In feudal Japan, when mountain mists concealed castle walls and the sound of steel rang through bamboo groves, a legendary warrior named Nobunaga faced his greatest military challenge. The morning sun cast long shadows across the encampment where his small army prepared for what seemed an impossible battle. Enemy forces outnumbered his men 10-1, their banners stretching across the distant valley like a dark sea of certain defeat. Nobunaga himself felt confident in his strategy and timing. His years of experience had taught him to read the subtle signs that determine victory, the morale of troops, the positioning of forces, the quality of leadership, and the element of surprise. He knew with inner certainty that his forces would prevail despite the overwhelming odds. But knowledge and confidence are not easily transferred from one mind to another. His soldiers, brave though they were, looked across at the massive enemy army with growing doubt and fear. Whispered conversations circulated through the ranks about the impossibility of their situation. Some spoke of honorable death, others of retreat, but few believed they could actually win the coming engagement. Their faces showed the strain of men preparing to fight against hopeless odds. Understanding that victory depends as much on the hearts of warriors as on the skills of strategy, Nobunaga devised a plan to transform his soldiers' despair into determined confidence. On the way to battle, he stopped his army at a small Shinto shrine nestled among ancient cedar trees. The sacred space emanated tranquility, its wooden structures weathered smooth by centuries of prayers and offerings. Gathering his men around him, Nobunaga addressed them with solemn authority. "After I visit the shrine and offer prayers for our success, I will toss a coin," he announced. "If heads appears, we will win this battle decisively. If tails shows, we will lose. Destiny holds us in her powerful hand, and we must accept whatever fate reveals. The soldiers watched intently as their commander entered the shrine alone. Through the wooden slats, they could see him bowing deeply before the altar, his lips moving in what appeared to be fervent prayer to the gods for guidance and protection. When Nobunaga emerged from the shrine, every eye was fixed upon him. He reached into his sleeve and withdrew a single coin, holding it high so all could see. The metal caught the morning light as he tossed it spinning into the air. Time seemed suspended as the coin turned over and over, finally landing with a clear metallic ring on the stone path. Heads. A tremendous cheer erupted from the assembled warriors. Their doubt transformed instantly into jubilant confidence. If destiny itself had decreed their victory, how could they fail? The gods had spoken through the sacred coin, and their fate was sealed. The soldiers' energy became electric with anticipation rather than dread. When the battle commenced, Nobunaga's forces fought with such fierce determination and unwavering belief in their destined victory that they overwhelmed the larger enemy army completely. Their conviction became a weapon more powerful than any sword, creating the very victory that the coin had supposedly predicted. After the triumph, as they celebrated around the evening campfires, Nobunaga's personal attendant approached his master with admiration. "Truly, my lord, no one can change the hand of destiny. The gods showed us our fate, and it came to pass exactly as foretold." Nobunaga smiled and reached into his sleeve. "Indeed not," he said quietly, showing his attendant a coin that had been specially crafted, with heads facing both sides. There had never been any possibility of tails appearing. The Buddha taught, "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world." This teaching reveals the profound truth underlying Nobunaga's strategy, that external circumstances often matter less than the internal state of consciousness we bring to them. Why do we so readily surrender our power to external forces, whether we call them destiny, fate, luck, or circumstances beyond our control? Buddhism identifies several psychological patterns that create this disempowerment. First is our tendency to externalize both credit and blame, rather than recognizing our role in creating our experiences. When things go well, we attribute success to favorable conditions. When they go poorly, we blame bad luck or unfair circumstances. Second is our misunderstanding of the relationship between acceptance and action. Many people interpret spiritual teachings about accepting what is as passivity or fatalism, missing the dynamic interplay between inner acceptance and skillful outer engagement. Nobunaga accepted the reality of his situation while simultaneously taking creative action to transform it. Third is our underestimation of the power of belief and confidence in shaping outcomes. Modern psychology confirms what ancient wisdom traditions have long taught, that our mental state profoundly influences our performance, resilience, and ability to recognize opportunities. The soldier's transformation from doubt to confidence created the very conditions for victory. Zen Master Bankei taught, "If you want to know what you'll be in your next life, look at what you're doing now. If you want to know what you were in your past life, look at your present circumstances." This points to a more nuanced understanding of destiny, not as external fate imposed upon us, but as the natural result of our thoughts, intentions, and actions. Consider situations in your own life where you felt at the mercy of circumstances beyond your control. Perhaps you're facing a challenging work situation, a difficult relationship, a health concern, or a financial obstacle. How much of your sense of helplessness comes from focusing on external factors rather than recognizing your own creative power within the situation? The Buddha said, "It is our own mental attitude which makes the world for us. Our thoughts make things beautiful. Our thoughts make things ugly. The whole world is in our mind. Learn to see things in the proper light." Nobunaga understood this principle deeply. He couldn't change the numerical odds, but he could transform his soldiers' relationship to those odds. The story also reveals something profound about the nature of skillful leadership. Rather than trying to convince his soldiers through logical arguments about strategy and tactics, Nobunaga created an experience that shifted their entire emotional and psychological state. He understood that transformation often happens through engagement with symbols and stories, rather than through rational persuasion. This doesn't suggest that we should manipulate others or deceive ourselves about reality. Rather, it points to the importance of recognizing how much our interpretation of circumstances shapes our response to them. The facts of any situation are always embedded within a context of meaning, and we have far more influence over that context than we typically realize. In Zen practice, we cultivate what might be called creative acceptance, fully acknowledging what is while remaining actively engaged with what's possible. This balance prevents both passive resignation and anxious struggle. We accept the coin toss of circumstances while recognizing our power to influence how that toss lands through our preparation, attitude, and response. The Buddha taught, "Health is the greatest gift, contentment the greatest wealth, faithfulness the best relationship." These gifts depend not on external conditions, but on our internal state of consciousness. When we understand this, we become like Nobunaga, accepting the hand we're dealt while playing it with wisdom and skill. Tonight, as you reflect on the challenges currently facing you, can you identify where you might be surrendering power to external circumstances? What would it look like to accept your situation completely while simultaneously taking creative action to transform it? Perhaps the coin toss of your destiny has more heads than you've been assuming. As the Buddha said, what we think, we become. By taking responsibility for our thoughts and beliefs, we discover that we have been holding the coin of destiny in our own hands all along. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us explore a story that challenges our assumptions about harm and protection. This is the teaching about the many forms of killing. Master Gassen sat in the golden light of late afternoon, teaching his students in the simple meditation hall of his mountain temple. The ancient wooden beams creaked softly in the mountain breeze, and incense drifted through the air like prayers made visible. His disciples, having gathered for their regular instruction, expected to receive teachings about meditation techniques or Buddhist philosophy. Instead, Gassen began speaking about something that seemed at first to contradict the fundamental principles they had been studying. The first precept of Buddhism clearly states the importance of not killing, of protecting all sentient life from harm. This teaching forms the foundation of Buddhist ethics and guides practitioners toward vegetarianism, careful treatment of insects, and reverence for all living beings. Those who speak against killing and who desire to spare the lives of all conscious beings are right. Ghassan began, his voice carrying the authority of years of practice and realization. It is indeed good to protect even the smallest animals and insects. We should treat all life with the reverence it deserves. The students nodded in agreement, comfortable with this familiar teaching that aligned with their understanding of Buddhist compassion. They had learned to step carefully to avoid harming ants, to remove spiders gently from their quarters rather than killing them, and to choose food that caused the least possible suffering to other beings. But then, Master Ghassan's teaching took an unexpected turn that challenged their conventional understanding of what it means to kill and what it means to protect life. But what about those persons who kill time? He asked, his penetrating gaze moving slowly across the assembled students. What about those who are destroying wealth through wasteful consumption and meaningless luxury? And what of those who destroy political economy through corruption and greed? We should not overlook these forms of killing. The disciples felt their comfortable certainties beginning to shift. They had never considered that wasting time might be a form of killing, that squandering resources could be violence, or that economic destruction might violate the principle of non-harm. Ghassan's words opened doorways to understanding they had not previously imagined. Furthermore, the master continued, his voice growing more intense, what of the one who preaches without enlightenment? Such a person is killing Buddhism itself. This final statement struck the students like thunder in a clear sky. Here was their revered teacher suggesting that teaching spiritual principles without genuine realization was perhaps the most serious form of killing, the destruction of the very wisdom that could liberate countless beings from suffering. The room fell into profound silence as each student contemplated the implications of these words. They began to see how their narrow understanding of killing had blinded them to subtler but perhaps more damaging forms of harm. The protection of physical life, while important, was only one dimension of true compassion. The Buddha taught, as you sow, so shall you reap. As you give, so shall you receive. As you are, so shall you become. This teaching illuminates the deeper understanding of harm and benefit that Master Ghassan was revealing, that our actions create effects that ripple far beyond their immediate physical manifestations. Why do we tend to focus on obvious, direct forms of harm, while remaining blind to subtler but potentially more damaging destructions? Buddhist psychology identifies several factors that create this selective awareness. First is our attachment to literal, concrete thinking that recognizes only physical violence while missing psychological, spiritual, and systemic forms of damage. Second is our tendency to separate different aspects of life into unrelated categories, treating time, resources, truth, and wisdom as disconnected from our ethical obligations. This compartmentalization prevents us from seeing the interconnected web of relationships that our choices affect. Third is our unconscious assumption that good intentions excuse harmful results. We may waste time thinking it affects only ourselves, squander resources, believing we've earned the right to excess, or share unexamined spiritual ideas, assuming that any discussion of Dharma is beneficial. Ghassan's teaching about killing time reveals something profound about the nature of our most precious resource. Time is the fundamental currency of life itself, the raw material from which we create meaning, relationships, service, and awakening. When we kill time through mindless consumption, endless distraction, or purposeless activity, we're destroying irreplaceable opportunities for growth and contribution. Consider how much time you spend each day in activities that neither nourish your own development nor serve others meaningfully. The hours lost to mindless scrolling, obsessive worry, petty arguments, or empty entertainment represent a form of violence against your own potential and against the world that could benefit from your awakened presence. The Buddha said, "The trouble is, you think you have time. This illusion of infinite time available leads us to treat moments carelessly, as if they were renewable resources rather than unique, unrepeatable gifts. When we truly understand the preciousness of time, wasting it begins to feel as unconscionable as destroying any other form of life." Gassen's observation about destroying wealth points to our responsibility as stewards of material resources. In a world where billions lack basic necessities, the wasteful consumption of resources for temporary pleasure or status represents a form of violence against those who are deprived. Our individual choices about consumption create collective patterns that determine how Earth's abundance is distributed. This doesn't mean embracing poverty or denying ourselves reasonable comfort, but rather cultivating awareness of how our material choices affect the larger web of life. When we purchase things we don't need, waste food we don't eat, or maintain lifestyles that consume far more than necessary, we participate in systems that kill opportunities for others to thrive. The teaching about destroying political economy speaks to our interconnectedness in social and economic systems. Individual corruption, dishonesty, or exploitation creates ripple effects that damage the trust and cooperation necessary for societies to function healthily. When we act from pure self-interest without considering collective welfare, we participate in killing the social fabric that supports everyone's well-being. Most challenging of all is Gassen's assertion that teaching without enlightenment kills Buddhism itself. This points to the sacred responsibility that comes with sharing spiritual wisdom. When we repeat teachings we haven't truly integrated, offer guidance beyond our actual understanding, or use spiritual concepts to enhance our ego rather than dissolve it, we risk distorting the very wisdom that could liberate others. Zen master Dogen taught, "To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. This forgetting of the limited self is what creates the authenticity necessary for genuine spiritual teaching. Without this realization, even well-intentioned sharing can become a form of spiritual materialism that obscures rather than reveals truth." Tonight, as you examine your own daily choices and their effects, can you identify subtle forms of killing you might not have previously recognized? What would it look like to extend your commitment to non-harm beyond the obvious into these more nuanced dimensions of life? Perhaps you'll discover that true protection of life requires not just avoiding physical violence, but actively cultivating life-giving choices in every aspect of your existence. As the Buddha taught, all beings fear death and pain. Comparing others to oneself, one should neither kill nor cause others to kill. This comparison extends beyond physical beings to include the killing of time, resources, truth, and wisdom. When we truly understand our interconnectedness, protecting all forms of life becomes a natural expression of our awakened heart. Let us now turn to a story that teaches about the humility required for authentic spiritual authority. This is the tale of Kassan's sweat. In a remote mountain monastery where autumn leaves drifted like golden prayers through the temple courtyard, Zen Master Kassan had spent many years cultivating his understanding and teaching a small community of devoted students. The temple was a place of profound tranquility, where the only sounds were the gentle striking of meditation bells, the whisper of robes moving across tatami mats, and the soft chanting of evening sutras. Kassan had developed a reputation throughout the region for his wisdom and composure. In the protected environment of his mountain retreat, surrounded by students who revered him and landscapes that inspired contemplation, he felt confident in his realization and comfortable in his role as a spiritual teacher. His days followed peaceful rhythms of meditation, study, and instruction, unmarked by the complexities and pressures of the outside world. One day, an unexpected request arrived that would test the depth of Kassan's spiritual development in ways he had never anticipated. A messenger brought word that Kassan had been asked to officiate at the funeral ceremony of a provincial lord, a man of great political importance whose death had created significant attention throughout the region. This invitation represented both an honor and a challenge. To be chosen for such a prominent ceremonial role indicated recognition of Kassan's spiritual standing. However, it also meant stepping outside the familiar confines of monastic life into a world of social protocol, political significance, and public scrutiny that he had never navigated before. Kassan had never met lords and nobles before. His entire adult life had been spent in the company of fellow monks and simple mountain villagers who approached him with natural respect and familiarity. The thought of conducting a ceremony before aristocrats, government officials, and other dignitaries filled him with unexpected anxiety. What if he made mistakes in protocol? What if his rustic monastery training was inadequate for such refined company? Despite his nervousness, Kassan accepted the responsibility and made his way to the elaborate ceremony. The funeral took place in a grand temple in the provincial capital, its architecture far more ornate than the simple wooden structures of his mountain home. Hundreds of elegantly dressed mourners filled the ceremonial space, their silk robes rustling as they moved with formal precision. When the ceremony began, Kassan found himself overwhelmed by the unfamiliar social atmosphere. The weight of so many sophisticated eyes upon him, the pressure of performing perfectly in such an important context, and his lack of experience with aristocratic customs combined to create intense discomfort. Despite his years of meditation practice and his genuine understanding of Buddhist teachings, he began to sweat profusely. The perspiration was not merely from physical exertion, but from the mental tension of trying to maintain his composure while feeling completely out of his element. His nervousness was visible to all present, contradicting the serene confidence expected from a Zen master in any circumstance. Somehow, Kassan managed to complete the ceremony without major errors, but he knew that his discomfort had been apparent to everyone present. The contrast between his usual composed presence in the monastery and his obvious anxiety in this foreign social environment revealed something important about the limitations of his spiritual development. After returning to his mountain temple, Kassan called his students together for an extraordinary announcement. Rather than pretending the funeral had gone well or making excuses for his performance, he spoke with radical honesty about what the experience had revealed. "I must confess to you," Kassan told his assembled pupils, "that I am not yet qualified to be your teacher. Today, I discovered that I lack the sameness of bearing in the world of fame and social complexity that I possess here in our secluded temple. My practice has been incomplete, developed only within comfortable and familiar circumstances." His students were shocked. They had never seen their teacher display such self-doubt or heard him question his own qualification to guide them. Many expected him to dismiss this single difficult experience as unimportant or to rationalize his nervousness as natural and acceptable. Instead, Kassan made a decision that demonstrated the depth of his commitment to authentic spiritual development. He announced his resignation as their teacher and his intention to become a student once again under another master who could help him develop the unshakable equanimity that he clearly lacked. For 8 years, Kassan studied with a new teacher, working specifically on developing the kind of consistent presence and unperturbable awareness that remains stable regardless of external circumstances. He practiced in urban environments, in politically charged situations, and in contexts that challenged his comfort and composure. When he finally returned to his former students 8 years later, he had been transformed. The man who came back to the mountain monastery carried himself with the same gentle dignity, whether addressing peasants or princes, whether in familiar or foreign environments. He had achieved the sameness of bearing that he had recognized was missing from his earlier teaching. His students, who had waited faithfully for his return, found themselves learning from a teacher whose authority now came not from intellectual understanding or monastic credentials, but from a deep and consistent realization that remained undisturbed by any external circumstance. The Buddha taught, "Better it is to live one day seeing the rise and fall of things than to live 100 years without ever seeing the rise and fall of things." Kassan's willingness to see clearly the rise and fall of his own composure became the foundation for his genuine spiritual maturity. Why do we so often resist acknowledging the limitations of our understanding or abilities? Buddhist psychology identifies several ego patterns that create this resistance. First is our attachment to identity and reputation. Once we're seen as knowledgeable or competent in any area, admitting limitations feels like a threat to our carefully constructed self-image. Second is our confusion of humility with humiliation. We fear that acknowledging our limitations will diminish us in others' eyes, when in fact, such honesty often increases genuine respect and trust. Kassan's students weren't disappointed by his confession. They were inspired by his integrity. Third is our tendency to compartmentalize our development, assuming that wisdom gained in one context automatically transfers to all others. Kassan had developed genuine understanding within the protected environment of monastic life, but discovered that this understanding hadn't been tested in the crucible of worldly complexity. Zen master Suzuki Roshi taught, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few." Kassan's willingness to return to beginner's mind after years of teaching demonstrated the kind of spiritual maturity that values growth over image, truth over comfort. Consider areas of your own life where you've developed confidence and competence within familiar contexts. How do you respond when those same skills are tested in unfamiliar or challenging circumstances? Do you make excuses for subpar performance? Or do you use such experiences as invitations for deeper development? The Buddha said, "A fool thinks himself to be wise, but a wise man knows himself to be a fool." This paradox points to the relationship between genuine wisdom and ongoing humility. The more we truly understand, the more we recognize how much we don't yet understand. Kassan's sweat revealed something more than nervousness. It showed the difference between theoretical understanding and embodied realization. He could explain Buddhist teachings eloquently and guide meditation skillfully within familiar contexts, but his understanding hadn't yet become stable enough to remain undisturbed by social pressure and unfamiliar expectations. True spiritual authority comes not from never being challenged or uncomfortable, but from maintaining inner stability regardless of external circumstances. This stability isn't achieved through avoiding difficulties, but through repeatedly testing our understanding in increasingly challenging contexts until it becomes unshakable. Tonight, as you reflect on your own areas of knowledge and competence, can you identify situations that might reveal limitations you haven't yet recognized? What would it look like to approach such discoveries with Kassan's honesty and commitment to authentic development rather than defensive rationalization? As the Buddha taught, 3 things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. Kassan's sweat revealed the truth about his incomplete development, and his response to that revelation became the foundation for his eventual mastery. Sometimes our greatest failures become doorways to our deepest wisdom. Let us continue on our journey. The next story reveals the power of transcendent perspective in a teaching that comes directly from the enlightened one himself. This is Buddha's own description of ultimate reality. In the shade of the great Bodhi tree, where the Buddha had achieved his awakening, disciples gathered during the peaceful hours of late afternoon to receive teachings from their beloved master. The leaves rustled gently overhead, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the ground like living mandalas. The air was warm and still, filled with the profound tranquility that seemed to emanate from the Buddha's very presence. On this particular day, rather than offering a parable or responding to questions, the Buddha chose to share his direct perception of reality as seen from the vantage point of complete enlightenment. His words would reveal how radically different the awakened consciousness views the world compared to ordinary perception. Speaking with the gentle authority that came from perfect understanding, the Buddha began to describe his vision. I consider the positions of kings and rulers as that of dust motes. I observe treasures of gold and gems as so many bricks and pebbles. The disciples listened with growing amazement as their teacher continued to dissolve the conventional hierarchies and values that governed ordinary human life. I look upon the finest silken robes as tattered rags. I see myriad worlds of the universe as small seeds of fruit, and the greatest lake in India as a drop of oil on my foot. With each comparison, the Buddha was revealing how enlightened consciousness perceives the relative nature of all phenomena. How things that seem overwhelmingly important from ordinary perspective appear insignificant when viewed from the standpoint of ultimate understanding. I perceive the teachings of the world to be the illusion of magicians, he continued, his voice carrying infinite compassion for the confusion that these illusions create in unawakened minds. I discern the highest conception of emancipation as a golden brocade in a dream, and view the holy path of the illuminated ones as flowers appearing in one's eyes. Now the Buddha was addressing even the most sacred concepts and practices, revealing that from the perspective of complete realization, even the spiritual path itself is ultimately empty of the solid reality we attribute to it. I see meditation as a pillar of a mountain, nirvana as a nightmare of daytime, he said, dismantling any attachment his disciples might have to meditation practice, or even to the goal of enlightenment itself. Finally, the Buddha concluded with observations about the conceptual frameworks through which humans typically organize their understanding. I look upon the judgment of right and wrong as the serpentine dance of a dragon, and the rise and fall of beliefs as but traces left by the four seasons. With these words, the enlightened one revealed that even moral judgments and philosophical systems, however necessary they might be for ordinary human functioning, are ultimately as impermanent and insubstantial as dragon dances or seasonal changes. The disciples sat in stunned silence, their conventional understanding of reality thoroughly challenged by this glimpse into awakened perception. Everything they had considered solid, important, and real had been revealed as temporary, relative, and ultimately empty of inherent significance. The Buddha taught, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form does not differ from emptiness. Emptiness does not differ from form. This fundamental teaching of Buddhism underlies every comparison he made in describing his enlightened perception, the recognition that all phenomena are empty of permanent, independent existence, while simultaneously manifesting as the play of consciousness itself. Why is it so difficult for unawakened minds to grasp this perspective? Buddhist psychology explains that our ordinary consciousness is constructed through layers of conceptual filters that create the appearance of solid, separate, and permanent phenomena. We become so identified with these mental constructions that we mistake them for ultimate reality itself. First is our tendency toward reification, treating abstract concepts, social constructions, and temporary appearances as if they possessed solid, unchanging essence. We see king and beggar as fundamentally different categories rather than as temporary roles being played by the same underlying Buddha nature. Second is our attachment to relative comparisons as absolute truths. We believe that gold is inherently more valuable than pebbles, that palaces are inherently superior to simple dwellings, or that spiritual achievement makes someone inherently better than ordinary people. The Buddha's vision reveals these as conventional agreements rather than ultimate realities. Third is our identification with the content of consciousness rather than with consciousness itself. We become so absorbed in the constantly changing parade of thoughts, emotions, perceptions, and experiences that we lose contact with the unchanging awareness within which all these phenomena arise and pass away. Zen Master Nagarjuna taught, all phenomena are neither existent nor non-existent, but are like a magical display, a mirage, clouds in the sky, foam on water, a dream, or an echo. This points to the middle way between believing things are absolutely real and believing they don't exist at all, recognizing them as appearances within consciousness that have conventional but not ultimate reality. Consider how your own perspective might shift if you could see through Buddha's eyes, even briefly. The urgent email that feels so important, the social status you're trying to maintain, the political beliefs you defend so passionately, the spiritual achievements you're proud of. How might these appear from the vantage point of enlightened awareness? This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to life or nihilistic about human concerns. The Buddha continued to teach, heal, and guide others for 45 years after his awakening. But his actions arose from compassion rather than attachment, from wisdom rather than ignorance about the ultimate nature of reality. The Buddha said, In the sky, there is no distinction of east and west. People create distinctions out of their own minds and then believe them to be true. Our conventional world is full of such mentally created distinctions that we then treat as absolute reality: rich and poor, success and failure, spiritual and mundane, sacred and ordinary. Buddha's vision reveals that these distinctions, while useful for practical purposes, are ultimately as insubstantial as directions in infinite space. They exist within consciousness, but have no independent reality outside of the minds that create and maintain them. This teaching also illuminates the paradox of spiritual practice itself. We use meditation to go beyond meditation, employ concepts to transcend conceptual thinking, and follow a path that ultimately reveals there is nowhere to go and nothing to achieve. As the Buddha observed, even the highest spiritual attainments are like flowers appearing in our eyes, meaningful within the dream of seeking, but empty when viewed from awakened understanding. Yet this emptiness is not a void, but the fullness of pure potential from which all experiences arise. When we recognize the dreamlike nature of all phenomena, we become free to engage with life playfully and compassionately, rather than with desperate attachment and grasping. Tonight, as you observe the thoughts and experiences arising in your consciousness, can you experiment with viewing them through Buddha's eyes? What would it feel like to see your current concerns as temporary weather patterns rather than ultimate reality? Perhaps you'll discover that this shift in perspective doesn't diminish your engagement with life, but rather frees you to participate more fully and joyfully in the cosmic dream. As the Buddha taught, all conditioned things are impermanent. Strive diligently. This final instruction reveals the ultimate paradox. Even while recognizing the dreamlike nature of existence, we continue to strive with full engagement, knowing that our efforts too are part of the magnificent illusion that is enlightenment itself. Let us now turn to a tale that reveals the paradox of true worth beyond conventional measurement. This is the story of the head of a dead cat. In the mountains of ancient China, where morning mist wrapped around temple peaks like silk scarves and the sound of wooden bells echoed through pine forests, a young monk approached his teacher with a question that had been troubling him deeply. Master Sozan sat in quiet contemplation in his simple chamber, surrounded by the sparse furnishings that marked a life devoted entirely to spiritual understanding rather than material accumulation. The student had been observing the world beyond the monastery walls, with growing confusion about human values and priorities. He watched merchants haggling over silk and jade, officials competing for positions and titles, and even fellow monastics sometimes displaying attachment to precious texts or ceremonial objects. The entire human enterprise seemed organized around the pursuit and protection of things considered valuable, yet the student sensed something fundamentally misguided in these pursuits. Bowing respectfully before his master, the young monk posed his question with earnest sincerity. Master Sozan, what is the most valuable thing in the world? I see people devoting their entire lives to acquiring wealth, power, knowledge, or spiritual merit. But I cannot understand what truly deserves our highest regard. The student expected to receive a teaching about Buddha nature, the preciousness of human life, the value of wisdom, or perhaps the importance of compassion. These seemed like the kinds of profound concepts that would be considered most valuable from a Buddhist perspective. Instead, Master Sozan's response was so unexpected and seemingly absurd that it stopped the student's thinking mind completely, the head of a dead cat. The young monk stared at his teacher in bewilderment. Of all the possible answers to such a serious philosophical question, this seemed the most ridiculous. A dead cat's head appeared to be not just worthless, but actively repulsive. Something to be quickly buried or burned rather than treasured. "Master," the student said carefully, wondering if he had somehow misunderstood. "Why is the head of a dead cat the most valuable thing in the world? How can something so apparently worthless be considered more precious than gold, gems, wisdom, or enlightenment itself?" Sozan's explanation was even more puzzling than his initial answer. Because no one can name its price. With these simple words, the master had revealed something profound about the nature of value that completely transcended conventional economic thinking. The student sat in contemplative silence, slowly beginning to grasp the depth of this teaching that had initially seemed so absurd. The Buddha once declared, "Health is the greatest wealth, peace of mind the greatest happiness." This teaching points toward the same understanding that Master Sozan conveyed through his shocking metaphor, that the most valuable things in existence cannot be bought, sold, or possessed in the conventional sense. Why do we become so confused about what constitutes genuine value? Buddhist analysis reveals several mental patterns that distort our understanding. First is our tendency to measure worth through scarcity and demand rather than intrinsic benefit. We assign high value to rare gems while overlooking the incalculable worth of sunlight, air, and water, elements essential for all life, yet freely available to everyone. Second is our habit of commodifying everything, including experiences and relationships that lose their essential nature when treated as possessions to be acquired and owned. We try to purchase happiness, buy love, and accumulate spiritual merit as if enlightenment were a commodity available in the marketplace of religious practice. Third is our confusion of price with value, assuming that expensive things must be more worthwhile than inexpensive ones. This economic thinking infiltrates every aspect of life, leading us to undervalue simple pleasures, ordinary moments, and freely given kindness while overvaluing branded experiences and status symbols. Sozan's dead cat head represents perfect worthlessness from a conventional perspective, combined with perfect pricelessness from an ultimate perspective. No one would want to buy such a thing, which means it cannot be corrupted by market forces or reduced to monetary terms. In its complete uselessness, it becomes a symbol of value beyond valuation. Consider the things in your own life that are truly priceless. Moments of perfect contentment, the trust of a friend, the laughter of a child, the sensation of breathing freely, the simple fact of being conscious and aware. These experiences cannot be purchased at any price, yet they constitute the actual substance of a meaningful life. Zen Master Ikkyu taught, "That stone Buddha deserves all the bird droppings it gets. I wave my skinny arms like a tall flower in the wind." This irreverent observation points to the same understanding, that sacredness cannot be captured in objects or concepts, no matter how revered or expensive they might be. The Buddha said, "Do not overrate what you have received, nor envy others. Those who envy others do not obtain peace of mind." This teaching reveals how our preoccupation with comparative value, having more or better things than others, actually prevents us from recognizing the immeasurable wealth we already possess. Modern consumer culture depends entirely on our forgetting Sozen's teaching. Advertising works by convincing us that happiness, status, identity, and fulfillment can be purchased, that the right products, experiences, or lifestyles will provide the satisfaction we seek. But every purchase eventually reveals its limitations, leading to the endless cycle of acquisition and disappointment. The dead cat's head also represents something profound about the nature of reality itself. From the perspective of ultimate truth, all phenomena, including our most cherished possessions and achievements, are as temporary and insubstantial as that decomposing head. Our attachment to things as if they were permanent and truly valuable creates suffering when their inevitable impermanence becomes apparent. Yet this recognition of universal impermanence doesn't lead to nihilism, but rather to appreciation. When we understand that nothing can be permanently owned or controlled, we become capable of enjoying things without grasping them. The sunset is more beautiful when we don't try to capture it in photographs. The conversation is more meaningful when we don't record it for later. And life itself is more precious when we don't pretend it will last forever. In Zen aesthetics, there is a concept called wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. The dead cat's head embodies this aesthetic perfectly. It cannot be improved, preserved, or made more valuable through any human effort. Its worth lies precisely in its complete acceptance of what it is without pretense or potential for enhancement. Tonight, as you take inventory of your possessions, achievements, and aspirations, can you identify what in your life is truly priceless? What experiences, relationships, or simple realities exist beyond the realm of economic calculation? Perhaps you'll discover that you've been carrying immeasurable treasure all along without recognizing its value because no one ever taught you how to name its price. As the Buddha taught, better than ruling the whole world, better than going to heaven, better than lordship over all the worlds is the first step on the path to enlightenment. This first step begins with recognizing that what we seek cannot be purchased but only awakened to, like discovering that the head of a dead cat has been priceless all along. Our next story speaks to the wisdom of understanding the difference between outer silence and inner quietude. This is the tale of 4 students learning to be silent. In a mountain monastery in ancient Japan, where cherry blossoms drifted like snow through temple gardens, and the sound of meditation bells marked the gentle passage of days, 4 young students of the Tendai school devoted themselves to intensive spiritual practice. Long before Zen Buddhism had fully established itself in Japan, these sincere practitioners followed the traditional meditation methods of their lineage, seeking enlightenment through disciplined study and contemplative exercises. The 4 students had developed a close friendship through their shared dedication to the spiritual path. They spent their days studying sacred texts, practicing sitting meditation, and engaging in philosophical discussions about the nature of mind and reality. Their bond was strengthened by mutual respect for each other's sincerity and progress in understanding the Dharma. One autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled around the monastery courtyard and the air carried the crisp promise of winter's approach, the 4 friends made a significant decision together. They would undertake a 7-day period of complete silence as an intensive meditation retreat. This practice, they believed, would deepen their contemplative abilities and accelerate their spiritual development. The commitment they made to each other was simple but profound. For 7 consecutive days and nights, none of them would speak a single word. They would communicate only through necessary gestures, maintain their regular meditation schedule, and observe how the absence of verbal expression affected the quality of their awareness and inner peace. The first day proceeded beautifully. All 4 students maintained their silence with apparent ease, moving through their daily routines of meditation, meals, and temple duties with serene mindfulness. The absence of conversation seemed to create a deeper quality of attention, allowing them to notice subtle sounds, sensations, and mental movements they typically missed during ordinary daily chatter. As evening approached and the oil lamps cast flickering shadows across the meditation hall, the peaceful atmosphere of their retreat seemed perfectly established. The students felt confident in their ability to maintain this silence for the remaining 6 days, and their meditation had indeed begun auspiciously. However, as night deepened and the oil lamps began to burn low, their commitment faced its first test. The dancing flames grew dimmer and dimmer, threatening to leave the meditation hall in complete darkness. One of the students, noticing that a temple servant was nearby, found himself unable to tolerate the practical problem of inadequate lighting. "Fix those lamps," he called out to the servant, his voice cutting through the silence like a sharp blade through silk. The words escaped before he could stop them, motivated by his desire to maintain proper conditions for their meditation practice. But the moment he spoke, he realized with dismay that he had broken the very vow he had made only hours earlier. The second student was astonished to hear his friend speak. He had assumed that all 4 would maintain their commitment with equal determination. His surprise and disappointment overcame his own resolve to remain silent. "We are not supposed to say a word," he remarked to the first student, his tone carrying a mixture of reproach and disbelief. No sooner had these words left his mouth than he too realized the irony of his situation. In the very act of reminding his friend about their vow of silence, he had violated that same vow himself. The third student had been watching this exchange with growing incredulity. How could his 2 friends be so obviously hypocritical, breaking their silence in order to discuss their silence? His sense of superiority and judgment overcame his own commitment to remaining quiet. "You 2 are stupid. Why did you talk?" he asked, his voice filled with criticism and self-righteousness. Even as the words emerged, he recognized the absurdity of his position. In criticizing others for speaking, he had spoken himself, falling into the exact same trap he was condemning. The 4th student had observed this entire sequence with a mixture of amusement and dismay. He watched each of his friends succumb to the same pattern of breaking their vow, while attempting to address or criticize others for breaking their vows. Feeling quite pleased with his own superior discipline and self-control, he made his own fatal mistake. "I am the only one who has not talked," he concluded with obvious pride and satisfaction. With these words, the 4th student completed the comedy of errors. In the very act of congratulating himself for maintaining silence, he destroyed his own accomplishment. The irony was perfect. Each student had broken their vow while focusing on the failure of others to maintain theirs. As the Buddha taught, better than 1,000 useless words is one word that brings peace. This teaching illuminates the deeper issue revealed by the 4 students' experience, that true silence is not merely the absence of speech, but the presence of inner tranquility that remains undisturbed by external circumstances. Why do we find it so difficult to maintain the commitments we make to ourselves and others? Buddhist psychology identifies several mental patterns that create this challenge. First is our tendency toward reactive behavior, automatically responding to situations without the pause of mindful awareness that would allow us to remember our deeper intentions. The first student reacted to the practical problem of dim lighting without considering how his response would affect his spiritual commitment. His attachment to comfortable meditation conditions overwhelmed his dedication to silence practice. Second is our habit of monitoring others' behavior while remaining unconscious of our own patterns. The second and third students were so focused on their friends' failures that they became blind to their own identical mistakes. This outward focus prevents the self-awareness necessary for maintaining inner discipline. Third is our tendency towards spiritual pride and competitive comparison. The fourth student's satisfaction with his supposed superiority created the very conditions for his downfall. His ego gratification became more important than his actual practice. Zen master Huang Po taught, "Your everyday mind, that is the way. When you try to turn toward it, you move away from it." This points to the fundamental paradox the students encountered. The more they tried to enforce silence through willful effort and mutual monitoring, the further they moved from genuine quietude. Consider situations in your own life where good intentions have been undermined by reactive patterns, judgment of others, or spiritual pride. Perhaps you've committed to a meditation schedule only to abandon it when circumstances became challenging. Maybe you've criticized others for behaviors you yourself display. Or you might have felt superior to those struggling with issues you believe you've mastered. The Buddha said, "Hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is a law eternal." This same principle applies to the inner noise that true silence seeks to address. We cannot achieve inner quiet through forceful suppression of thoughts or aggressive monitoring of our mental state. Real silence emerges naturally when we stop struggling with the contents of consciousness and instead rest in the awareness that observes all mental activity without being disturbed by it. The students were trying to create silence by controlling external expression while ignoring the internal commentary that was generating their reactive responses. The story also reveals how spiritual practice can become corrupted by ego involvement. Each student transformed their meditation retreat into an opportunity for self-congratulation or criticism of others. Their focus shifted from inner development to comparative performance, missing the point of the practice entirely. True spiritual discipline requires what Buddhist teachers call right effort, sustained attention that is neither too tight nor too loose, neither forcing nor passive. Like tuning a stringed instrument, our practice needs to find the middle way between extremes of tension and relaxation. Tonight, as you notice the constant stream of internal commentary that accompanies your daily experience, can you experiment with genuine silence? Not the suppression of thoughts, but the recognition of the awareness in which all thoughts arise and pass away. Perhaps you'll discover that this natural quietude has been available all along, requiring no effort to maintain and no words to defend. As the Buddha taught, silence is an empty space. Space is the home of the awakened mind. The four students eventually learned that true silence cannot be achieved through trying, but only through stopping the very effort that disturbs our natural peace. In this stopping we discover the silence that was never broken and the peace that requires no protection. Now let us explore a story that illuminates the power of uncompromising honesty over flattering deception. This is the tale of the Blockhead Lord. In the rolling hills of feudal Japan, where ancient castles overlooked terraced rice fields and cherry trees lined the roads like rows of praying monks, a wealthy provincial lord found himself drawn to the profound teachings of Zen Buddhism. His castle, adorned with painted screens and surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens, housed extensive libraries and attracted scholars from across the realm. Yet he felt a persistent emptiness that material luxury and intellectual pursuits could not fill. Having heard of Zen's promise to reveal the true nature of mind directly, without dependence on scriptures or elaborate philosophical systems, the Lord decided to invite prominent Zen teachers to his estate. His intention was to study with them and potentially sponsor the construction of a temple that would bring the benefits of Zen practice to his domain. Two renowned masters accepted his invitation, Daigu and Gudo, each known throughout the region for their wisdom and different teaching styles. The Lord looked forward to meeting these distinguished teachers and expected that their presence would bring great honor to his household, while advancing his own spiritual development. When the day arrived for their visit, the Lord received the two masters with elaborate ceremony in his finest reception hall. Silk cushions were arranged precisely, rare incense filled the air with delicate fragrance, and servants moved silently to ensure every detail reflected the respect due to such esteemed guests. The Lord presented himself with the dignity appropriate to his station, while attempting to display the humility suitable for a spiritual seeker. He hoped to make a favorable impression that would encourage the masters to accept him as a worthy student and possibly agree to establish a teaching center under his patronage. Master Gudo spoke first, his manner courteous and encouraging. After observing the Lord's obvious sincerity and evident intelligence, he offered what seemed like appropriate recognition. "Your Lordship, it is clear that you are wise by nature and possess an inborn ability to learn Zen. Your quick understanding and natural depth suggest that you will make excellent progress in our practice." The Lord felt gratified by this assessment, which confirmed his own sense that he possessed special qualities that would enable rapid spiritual advancement. Gudo's words suggested that Zen study would be a natural fit for someone of his intellectual gifts and spiritual sensitivity. However, Master Daigu's response was shockingly different. "Nonsense," he said bluntly, his voice cutting through the polite atmosphere like a sword through silk. "Why do you flatter this blockhead? He may hold the title of Lord, but he doesn't know anything genuine about Zen or authentic spiritual understanding." The hall fell into stunned silence. No one had ever spoken to the Lord with such direct criticism, especially not in his own home and in the presence of guests. Servants exchanged glances of alarm, uncertain how their master would respond to such unprecedented disrespect. The Lord himself was initially shocked by Daigu's harsh assessment. Here was a man who had traveled considerable distance to accept his hospitality, only to insult him publicly and dismiss his spiritual capacities entirely. The natural response would have been anger, wounded pride, and immediate dismissal of such an ungrateful guest. But something in Daigu's directness struck the Lord as more authentic than Gudo's diplomatic encouragement. There was a quality of fearless honesty in the master's words that carried its own authority. Rather than speaking from political calculation or desire to please, Daigu seemed to be responding from pure perception of truth, regardless of consequences. The Lord recognized that Gudo's flattery, while pleasant to hear, was probably more about maintaining harmonious relations than providing accurate assessment. Daigu's criticism, though painful, had the ring of someone who cared more about spiritual truth than social comfort. After careful consideration, the Lord made a decision that surprised everyone present, including himself. Instead of building a temple for Gudo, who had praised his abilities and promised easy progress, he chose to build it for Daigu, who had called him a blockhead and dismissed his understanding. Furthermore, he committed himself to studying Zen under Daigu's demanding guidance, knowing that this teacher would continue to challenge his assumptions and refuse to coddle his ego. The Lord intuited that such uncompromising honesty, however uncomfortable, offered the best possibility for genuine spiritual development. Under Daigu's instruction, the Lord discovered that real Zen practice involved the continual dismantling of pride, pretension, and false understanding. Rather than confirming his special qualities, the training revealed the depth of his ignorance and the subtlety of his self-deception. As the Buddha taught, a friend who is not in need is a friend indeed. This teaching points to the profound difference between those who tell us what we want to hear and those who tell us what we need to hear for genuine growth and development. Why do we so readily prefer comfortable lies over challenging truths? Buddhist psychology identifies several ego patterns that create this preference. First is our attachment to self-image and the stories we tell ourselves about our abilities, intelligence, and spiritual advancement. We naturally gravitate toward people and teachings that confirm these flattering narratives while avoiding those that question them. Gudo's approach appealed to the Lord's desire to see himself as naturally gifted and destined for easy spiritual success. This kind of encouragement feels good initially, but often prevents the deep questioning and ego dissolution necessary for authentic awakening. Second is our tendency to confuse kindness with enabling and mistake honesty for cruelty. We often interpret direct feedback as personal attack, rather than recognizing it as the gift of clear perception offered without ulterior motive. Daigu's apparent harshness was actually the deepest form of compassion, the willingness to speak truth regardless of its reception, motivated by genuine concern for the Lord's spiritual welfare, rather than personal comfort or political advantage. Third is our inclination to choose teachers and advisors based on how they make us feel, rather than on their capacity to help us grow. We seek confirmation of our existing understanding, rather than transformation of our limited perspective. Zen Master Linji taught, "If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him." This radical instruction points to the necessity of destroying all fixed concepts and comfortable assumptions, including those about our own spiritual accomplishments and natural abilities. Consider the feedback you receive in various areas of your life and notice your reactions to different types of responses. Do you find yourself drawn to those who praise your abilities while dismissing those who point out areas for improvement? How do you distinguish between genuine encouragement and empty flattery? The Buddha said, "Three things can be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth." Daigu's willingness to speak uncomfortable truth created conditions where authentic learning could occur, while Gudo's diplomatic approach, however well-intentioned, obscured rather than revealed the Lord's actual spiritual condition. The story also illuminates different approaches to spiritual authority and teaching. Some teachers focus primarily on building students' confidence and maintaining harmonious relationships. Others prioritize direct transmission of truth, regardless of its immediate reception. Both approaches have their place, but transformative growth often requires the willingness to have our comfortable assumptions challenged. Real spiritual friendship involves the courage to see each other clearly and speak honestly about what we observe. This requires both the wisdom to discern when such directness is helpful and the skill to deliver challenging feedback with underlying love rather than judgment. Tonight, as you reflect on the various voices in your life offering guidance and feedback, can you distinguish between those who serve your ego and those who serve your awakening? What would it look like to actively seek out the kind of honest reflection that Daigu provided, even when it contradicts your preferred self-image? As the Buddha taught, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. Sometimes the deepest love expresses itself through the willingness to risk relationship for the sake of truth, offering the hard medicine of reality rather than the sweet poison of comfortable delusion. The next tale is about the profound power of silent example over direct confrontation in creating authentic transformation. This is the tale of Ryokan and his nephew. In the quiet mountains of Japan, where bamboo groves whispered ancient secrets and streams carried the songs of countless seasons to the sea, the Zen monk Ryokan devoted his entire existence to the study and practice of the Buddha's way. His life was one of profound simplicity, owning nothing but his robes, begging bowl, and the poems he composed during long walks through forest paths where dewdrops caught morning light like suspended prayers. Ryokan had renounced all worldly concerns to pursue enlightenment, leaving behind family responsibilities and the management of his hereditary estate to focus completely on spiritual development. Years passed in peaceful solitude, marked only by the changing seasons and the deepening of his understanding through meditation and contemplation. One day, disturbing news reached Ryokan at his remote mountain hermitage. His nephew, who had assumed responsibility for managing the family property and estate in Ryokan's absence, was squandering the inheritance through reckless behavior. Despite repeated warnings and entreaties from concerned relatives, the young man was spending enormous sums on a courtesan, neglecting his duties, and allowing the family's carefully accumulated wealth to dissipate rapidly. The situation had become critical. Generations of careful stewardship were being undone by one person's self-indulgent choices. The family property, which supported not only the nephew but also various dependents and community obligations, was in serious danger of being lost entirely. Feeling desperate about this deteriorating situation, the relatives turned to Ryokan as their last hope. Perhaps the respected monk's moral authority and family connection could influence the nephew where other interventions had failed. They pleaded with Ryokan to travel to the young man's residence and use his spiritual influence to reform this destructive behavior. The request placed Ryokan in a difficult position. His spiritual practice emphasized non-interference and acceptance of what is, yet his family loyalty and compassion for all involved, including the nephew himself, suggested some response was appropriate. After careful consideration, he agreed to make the journey. The trip required Ryokan to travel a considerable distance from his mountain retreat to the town where his nephew lived. He had not seen the young man for many years, and their reunion carried the weight of changed circumstances and unspoken expectations. When Ryokan arrived at his nephew's residence, the young man seemed genuinely pleased to see his uncle again. Despite his recent troubles, he maintained enough respect for family connections to welcome Ryokan warmly and invite him to stay overnight. The nephew appeared to sense nothing of the ulterior purpose behind this unexpected visit. Throughout the evening, relatives and neighbors waited for Ryokan to address the pressing issue that had brought him such a long way. They expected lectures about responsibility, warnings about the consequences of continued excess, or appeals to family honor and duty. Surely, a respected Zen teacher would use this opportunity to provide moral guidance and practical counsel. But Ryokan said nothing about the courtesan, the wasted money, or the concerns of the family. Instead, he spent the entire night in silent meditation, sitting motionless in the traditional posture while his nephew slept nearby. The old monk's presence filled the room with profound tranquility, demonstrating through his bearing the peace that comes from a life devoted to spiritual cultivation. When morning came and Ryokan prepared to depart, the relatives' anticipation reached its peak. Surely now he would deliver the confrontational message they had requested, the direct challenge to the nephew's behavior that might shock him into reformation. Instead, as Ryokan gathered his few possessions, he made a simple request that seemed completely unrelated to the serious purpose of his visit. "I must be getting old," he said with gentle humility. "My hands shake so much these days. Will you help me tie the string of my straw sandal?" The nephew responded immediately with natural kindness, kneeling to assist his elderly uncle with the simple task. His movements were careful and respectful, showing genuine concern for his relative's physical limitations. "Thank you," Ryokan said softly when the sandal was secured. "You see, a man becomes older and feebler day by day. Take good care of yourself." With these words, the old monk departed, leaving everyone puzzled by his approach. He had never mentioned the courtesan, the financial irresponsibility, or the family's concerns. He had offered no lectures, made no demands, and issued no warnings about consequences. Yet, from that very morning, the nephew's dissolute behavior ended completely. The relationship with the courtesan was terminated, financial responsibility resumed, and the family estate was preserved. The transformation was immediate and lasting, though its mechanism remained mysterious to everyone except perhaps the nephew himself. The Buddha declared, "Your actions speak so loudly, I cannot hear what you are saying." This teaching illuminates the profound principle underlying Ryokan's approach, that authentic influence operates through the power of embodied wisdom, rather than through verbal persuasion or moral argument. Why did Ryokan's gentle, indirect approach succeed where direct confrontation had failed? Buddhist understanding reveals several factors that make silent example more powerful than verbal instruction. First is the natural human resistance to being told what to do, especially when we already know our behavior is problematic. Direct moral pressure often triggers defensive responses that strengthen rather than weaken destructive patterns. Second is the power of witnessing authentic spiritual presence to awaken our own deeper nature. The nephew spent an entire night in the company of someone who embodied the peace, simplicity, and wisdom that he himself had been seeking through external pleasures. This direct exposure to genuine contentment revealed the futility of his substitute satisfactions. Third is the impact of unconditional love and acceptance in creating space for transformation. Ryokan's refusal to judge or criticize allowed the nephew to see his own behavior clearly, without the defensive reactions that typically arise when we feel attacked or condemned. Zen Master Dogen taught, "To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self." Ryokan's presence reminded his nephew of his own Buddha nature, the inherent wisdom and compassion that had been obscured by self-indulgent behavior but never destroyed. Consider situations in your own life where you've wanted to influence someone else's behavior, perhaps a family member's harmful habits, a friend's poor choices, or a colleague's problematic patterns. How often have direct confrontations and logical arguments actually created the changes you hope to see? The Buddha said, "Hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule." Ryokan understood that the nephew's self-destructive behavior arose from inner suffering and confusion rather than from malicious intent. Addressing this behavior with judgment and criticism would only increase the underlying pain that was driving it. The simple request for help with the sandal created a moment of genuine human connection that bypassed all the nephew's defensive mechanisms. In that moment of natural service, the young man experienced his own essential kindness and care for others, qualities that were incompatible with continued self-centered indulgence. Ryokan's comment about aging and fragility also served multiple purposes. It reminded the nephew of life's impermanence and the precious nature of time and relationships. It demonstrated humility and vulnerability rather than moral superiority, and it expressed genuine care for the nephew's well-being without any agenda or manipulation. The story also reveals something profound about the nature of true reformation. Lasting change rarely occurs through external pressure or forced compliance. Instead, it emerges when people reconnect with their own deeper values and natural wisdom. Ryokan created conditions for this reconnection without trying to force any particular outcome. Tonight, as you consider relationships where you'd like to see positive changes, can you experiment with Ryokan's approach of embodying the qualities you hope to encourage, rather than demanding them through argument or pressure? What would it look like to trust that the same Buddha nature you're trying to awaken in others is also working in you? As the Buddha taught, if you light a lamp for somebody, it will also brighten your path. Ryokan's silent lamp of presence illuminated not only his nephew's way forward, but also demonstrated the profound effectiveness of love expressed through being rather than doing, through presence rather than preaching. Let us now explore a lesser-known Zen story that reveals profound wisdom about the nature of our emotional patterns. This is the teaching of Bankei and the ungovernable temper. Master Bankei sat in the peaceful courtyard of his temple, where late afternoon sunlight filtered through pine branches and cast gentle shadows on the weathered stone paths. His reputation for direct, uncompromising wisdom had spread throughout Japan, drawing seekers from distant provinces who hoped to receive teachings that could penetrate to the heart of their spiritual difficulties. On this particular day, a student approached with evident distress written across his features. His posture carried the weight of someone wrestling with a persistent inner demon, and his eyes reflected the frustration of many failed attempts at self-improvement. Bowing deeply before the master, he spoke with urgent sincerity about a problem that had plagued him for years. "Master Bankei," the student said, his voice tight with anxiety, "I have an ungovernable temper that causes me great suffering and harms my relationships with others. When anger arises, it consumes me completely, and I say and do things I later deeply regret. Despite my best efforts to control this tendency, it continues to overwhelm me. How can I cure this terrible affliction? The student expected to receive meditation instructions, breathing techniques, or philosophical teachings about the nature of anger and its antidotes. Perhaps the master would prescribe specific practices for cultivating patience or methods for recognizing anger before it became destructive. Instead, Bankei's response was characteristically direct and unexpected. "You have something very strange indeed. Let me see what you have." The student was puzzled by this request. He had described his temper as a persistent psychological pattern, not as a physical object that could be displayed upon request. "Master," he replied hesitantly, "just now I cannot show it to you." Bankei pressed further with apparent curiosity. "When can you show it to me? If this temper is truly yours, surely you can produce it for examination." "It arises unexpectedly," the student explained, growing more confused by the direction of this conversation. "I never know when it will appear, and when it does, it seems to have a life of its own." "Then," concluded Bankei, with gentle but absolute authority, "it must not be your own true nature. If it were genuinely yours, you could show it to me at any time, just as you can show me your hand or your face whenever requested." The master continued with devastating logic. "When you were born, you did not have this ungovernable temper. Your parents did not give it to you as they gave you your eyes or your nose. It is not an inherent part of your being, but rather something you have learned to identify with so completely that you mistake it for yourself." "Think that over," Bankei concluded, leaving the student to contemplate the implications of this radical reframing. The Buddha once proclaimed, "You are not your thoughts, you are not your emotions, you are not your body. You are the awareness that observes all these phenomena arising and passing away." This teaching points directly to the profound shift in understanding that Bankei offered his troubled student. The recognition that we are not identical with our psychological patterns, no matter how persistent or overwhelming they might seem. Why do we so readily identify with our emotional reactions and mental habits? Buddhist psychology reveals several factors that create this confusion. First is our tendency toward reification, treating temporary mental formations as if they were solid, permanent aspects of our identity. We say, "I am an angry person," rather than "anger sometimes arises in awareness." This linguistic habit reflects a deeper conceptual error. We merge with our experiences so completely that we lose sight of the awareness in which they appear. The student had become so identified with his anger pattern that he couldn't imagine himself without it, even though this very pattern caused him considerable suffering. Second is our belief that persistent patterns must be fundamental aspects of our nature. Because the student's temper had appeared regularly over many years, he assumed it was an unchangeable characteristic rather than a learned response that could be unlearned through understanding and practice. Third is our failure to recognize the space between stimulus and response, the moment of choice that exists even in the most automatic seeming reactions. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychologist, expressed this principle. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Bankei's teaching method reveals something profound about the nature of authentic spiritual inquiry. Rather than providing techniques for managing anger, he questioned the fundamental assumption underlying the student's problem, the belief that this temper was actually his to manage. Consider your own persistent emotional patterns or psychological tendencies that you consider unchangeable aspects of your personality. Perhaps you identify as an anxious person, naturally impatient, or prone to depression. How might your relationship to these patterns shift if you recognize them as temporary weather systems passing through the sky of awareness rather than as permanent features of your psychological landscape? Zen Master Huangpo taught, "Your ordinary mind, that is the way." This ordinary mind is not the collection of thoughts, emotions, and reactions we typically identify with, but rather the natural awareness that remains present and undisturbed, regardless of what mental phenomena arise within it. The Buddha said, "All things arise, dwell, and dissolve back into awareness, like clouds forming and dissolving in the sky." Bankai's teaching pointed the student toward this sky-like nature of mind, the space within which anger arises and passes away, but which is never actually angry itself. This doesn't mean we should suppress or deny difficult emotions when they arise. Rather, it invites us to recognize our true nature as the awareness that can observe and hold all emotional states without being defined or limited by them. When we understand this, we can experience anger fully when it arises while knowing that it will pass and that our essential nature remains untouched. The implications of this understanding extend far beyond anger management. If we are not our thoughts, emotions, habits, or personal history, then what are we? This question points toward the heart of Zen inquiry, the direct recognition of our Buddha nature that exists prior to and independent of all temporary psychological formations. Bankei's approach also demonstrates the power of questioning our basic assumptions, rather than trying to fix problems at the level where we think they exist. The student was looking for better ways to control his anger, but Bankei revealed that the entire framework of my anger was based on a misunderstanding. In practical terms, this teaching suggests that when difficult emotions arise, we can ask ourselves, who is experiencing this? What is aware of this anger, anxiety, sadness? This inquiry naturally creates space between the observer and the observed, reducing the likelihood of complete identification with temporary emotional states. Tonight, as you notice thoughts and emotions arising in your awareness, can you experiment with Bankai's perspective? What would it feel like to observe these mental phenomena as temporary visitors in the space of consciousness rather than as defining characteristics of who you are? As the Buddha taught, form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Our psychological patterns appear real and solid from one perspective, but when examined closely, they reveal themselves to be as insubstantial as clouds in an empty sky. In recognizing this emptiness, we discover the freedom that was always present, but temporarily obscured by our identification with what arises and passes away in awareness. Now let us journey to a remote temple where a simple question about reality reveals the confusion between inner and outer worlds. This is the story of Hogan and the stone mind. Master Hogan lived in profound solitude in a small country temple where the only sounds were wind through bamboo groves and the distant calling of mountain birds. His days followed natural rhythms, unmarked by the complexities of monastic politics or the distractions of urban temple life. In this quiet setting, his understanding had deepened through years of uninterrupted contemplation and direct engagement with the fundamental questions of existence. One crisp autumn day, when maple leaves drifted like scarlet prayers across the temple grounds, 4 traveling monks appeared at Hogan's gate. They had been journeying between monasteries, studying with different teachers, and engaging in the kind of philosophical discussions that young practitioners often mistake for genuine spiritual inquiry. The travelers respectfully requested permission to make a fire in the temple yard to warm themselves before continuing their journey. Hogan welcomed them with natural hospitality, offering shelter and the simple comfort of shared warmth on a cold day. As the monks gathered wood and kindled their fire, their conversation resumed the intense philosophical debate they had apparently been conducting throughout their travels. Their voices carried the earnest intensity of those convinced that intellectual understanding could resolve the deepest mysteries of existence. Hogan overheard them arguing passionately about subjectivity and objectivity, a classic philosophical problem that had occupied Buddhist scholars for centuries. They debated whether external objects exist independently of consciousness, or whether everything we perceive is merely a projection of mind. Their discussion grew increasingly abstract and theoretical, with each monk defending his position through citations of various texts and logical arguments. Observing their intellectual wrestling match with compassionate amusement, Hogan decided to join their conversation. He approached the fire where the 4 monks sat warming their hands and offered a simple question that would cut through their elaborate philosophical constructions. "There is a big stone over there," Hogan said, gesturing toward a large boulder near the temple entrance. "Do you consider it to be inside or outside your mind?" The monks paused their debate, recognizing that their host was proposing a practical test of their theoretical understanding. This was exactly the kind of concrete application they needed to resolve their abstract arguments. One of the monks, confident in his grasp of Buddhist philosophy, responded immediately. "From the Buddhist viewpoint, everything is an objectification of mind. All phenomena are mental constructions, projections of consciousness itself. Therefore, I would say that the stone is inside my mind." His answer reflected sophisticated understanding of certain Buddhist teachings about the interdependence of subject and object, the role of consciousness in constructing experience, and the ultimate emptiness of independently existing phenomena. He felt pleased with this demonstration of his philosophical sophistication. Hogan's response was devastating in its simplicity. "Your head must feel very heavy if you are carrying around a stone like that in your mind." The directness of this observation cut through all the monks' elaborate theorizing, revealing the absurdity that results when we mistake intellectual concepts for lived reality. The other monks fell silent, suddenly aware that their heated philosophical debate had somehow missed the point entirely. The Buddha once declared, "Do not believe in anything simply because you have heard it spoken of many times. Do not believe in anything merely because it is written in your religious books. But after observation and analysis, when you find that anything agrees with reason and is conducive to the good and benefit of one and all, then accept it and live up to it." This teaching illuminates the trap that the traveling monks had fallen into, substituting intellectual knowledge about reality for direct experience of reality itself. Their debate about subjectivity and objectivity had become an elaborate mental construction that obscured rather than revealed the simple immediacy of their actual situation. Why do we so readily get lost in conceptual understanding while missing direct experience? Buddhist analysis identifies several mental habits that create this confusion. First is our tendency to prefer thinking about life to actually living it. The monks were so engaged in debating the nature of perception that they lost contact with the simple act of perceiving itself. Second is our attachment to philosophical positions and the identity we derive from holding sophisticated views. Each monk had invested considerable intellectual pride in his understanding of Buddhist philosophy, making it difficult to abandon these concepts even when they proved inadequate to actual experience. Third is our confusion of the map with the territory, mistaking conceptual descriptions of reality for reality itself. Buddhist teachings about the mind-only nature of experience are skillful pointers toward direct realization, not literal descriptions to be believed and defended intellectually. Hogan's response demonstrates the Zen emphasis on immediate practical wisdom over abstract philosophical speculation. His comment about the heavy head wasn't meant to ridicule the monk's intelligence, but rather to point out the practical consequence of taking conceptual teachings too literally. Consider how often your own thinking becomes trapped in similar conceptual constructions. Perhaps you debate whether events happen for a reason versus by pure chance, whether free will exists or everything is predetermined, or whether consciousness is produced by the brain or exists independently. These philosophical positions, however sophisticated, can become barriers to direct engagement with life as it actually unfolds. Zen Master Dogen taught, "To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things." This forgetting of conceptual self happens when we stop trying to figure out reality intellectually and instead allow ourselves to be fully present to immediate experience. The stone in Hogan's story represents the simple facticity of existence, things as they are before we overlay them with interpretations, categories, and philosophical frameworks. From one perspective, the stone is outside mind, in that it has apparent solidity and occupies space. From another perspective, it's inside mind, in that our experience of it depends entirely on consciousness. But these perspectives are both concepts arising within awareness itself. The Buddha said, "All conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your salvation with diligence." This work of salvation doesn't happen through resolving philosophical debates, but through direct insight into the nature of experience itself. When we stop carrying around heavy conceptual stones in our minds, we become available to the lightness and immediacy of unconditioned awareness. Hogan's teaching method reveals something important about authentic spiritual instruction. Rather than engaging the monk's philosophical debate on its own terms, he offered a practical demonstration that exposed the limitations of their entire approach. True teaching often works by undermining our attachment to the very questions we think are most important. The story also points to the middle way between extreme philosophical positions. The stone is neither purely objective nor purely subjective, but rather appears within the dynamic interaction of awareness and phenomena that transcends both categories. This understanding comes not through intellectual analysis, but through the direct recognition of how experience actually occurs. Tonight, as you encounter the various stones in your environment, the objects, people, and situations that make up your immediate experience, can you notice them without immediately overlaying conceptual interpretations? What would it feel like to experience things directly rather than through the filter of philosophical positions about their ultimate nature? As the Buddha taught, better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. Hogan's simple observation about the heavy head brought more genuine understanding than hours of sophisticated philosophical debate. Sometimes the most profound truths are hidden in the most obvious places, waiting to be discovered through direct seeing rather than conceptual thinking. Our next story speaks to the wisdom of understanding what constitutes genuine abundance and lasting happiness. This is the tale of Sengai and real prosperity. In the flourishing merchant quarters of Edo period Japan, where silk banners announced successful enterprises and the sound of coins rang through bustling marketplaces, a wealthy businessman had achieved everything that society defined as success. His trading ventures spanned multiple provinces. His warehouses overflowed with valuable goods, and his family enjoyed the finest luxuries available to the merchant class. Yet, despite his material accomplishments, the rich man felt troubled by concerns about the future. He had witnessed other prosperous families lose their fortunes through poor decisions, changing economic conditions, or simple misfortune. The impermanence that seemed to govern all worldly affairs filled him with anxiety about preserving his family's prosperity for future generations. Having heard of the wisdom and insight possessed by Zen masters, the wealthy merchant decided to seek spiritual guidance for his temporal concerns. He approached Master Sengai, whose reputation for profound understanding had spread throughout the region, carrying with him an expensive sheet of specially prepared paper and fine calligraphy materials. The merchant's request reflected the common belief that spiritual authority could somehow guarantee worldly success. "Master Sengai," he said with respectful deference, "I would be deeply honored if you would write something for the continued prosperity of my family, words of wisdom or blessing that might be treasured from generation to generation and help ensure our good fortune continues." He expected to receive an elegant poem about abundance, a prayer for divine protection, or perhaps philosophical reflections on the principles of successful business conduct. Such a document, written by a respected spiritual teacher, would become a family heirloom that could guide and inspire future generations while providing supernatural protection for their material well-being. Sengai accepted the request and the expensive paper without comment. Taking up his brush with careful deliberation, he composed his calligraphy with the same attention he might give to copying a sacred sutra. When he had finished, he presented the document to the eager merchant. The wealthy man unrolled the scroll expectantly, confident that he would find profound wisdom expressed in beautiful characters. Instead, he read 3 simple lines that seemed to mock his request. "Father dies, son dies, grandson dies." The merchant's face flushed with anger and disbelief. He had approached this renowned teacher with sincere respect and a genuine request for spiritual guidance, only to receive what appeared to be a cruel joke about death and loss. "Master," he said with barely controlled indignation, "I asked you to write something for the happiness and prosperity of my family. Why do you make such a mockery of my sincere request?" Sengai's response was delivered with gentle patience, as if explaining something obvious to a confused child. No joke is intended whatsoever. What I have written represents the deepest possible blessing for your family's true prosperity. The Master continued his explanation with compassionate directness. If before you yourself die, your son should pass away, this would cause you the most profound grief imaginable. If your grandson should die before your son, both of you would be utterly broken-hearted. The natural order would be disrupted, and your family would suffer the greatest possible tragedy. But if your family, generation after generation, passes away in the order I have written, father dying before son, son before grandson, this follows the natural course of life itself. Each person lives a full span of years, experiences the joys and challenges appropriate to their time, and departs when their season is complete. I call this real prosperity. The wealthy man sat in stunned silence as the profound truth of Sengai's teaching penetrated his consciousness. He had been seeking magical protection against the fundamental laws of existence, hoping that spiritual intervention could somehow exempt his family from the universal conditions that govern all life. The Buddha proclaimed, "Of all footprints, that of the elephant is supreme. Similarly, of all meditative themes, that on death is supreme." This teaching points to the transformative power of acknowledging mortality rather than denying it, recognizing that our deepest peace comes not from avoiding death, but from understanding its place in the natural order. Why do we struggle so intensely against accepting the fundamental impermanence of all conditions? Buddhist psychology identifies several mental patterns that create this resistance. First is our deep-seated denial of mortality and the illusion that somehow we and our loved ones can escape the universal law of impermanence through wealth, status, spiritual practice, or medical intervention. The merchant's request reflected this denial. He wanted Sengai's spiritual authority to create a protective bubble around his family that would exempt them from the uncertainties and losses that affect everyone else. This magical thinking prevents us from finding peace within the actual conditions of existence. Second is our confusion of security with the accumulation and preservation of external things. We believe that gathering enough wealth, building strong enough institutions, or creating detailed enough plans will provide genuine security against life's uncertainties. But true security comes from learning to find peace within impermanence itself. Third is our tendency to measure prosperity through possession and control, rather than through appreciation and acceptance. The merchant defined family prosperity as the indefinite continuation and expansion of material success. But Sengai revealed prosperity as the natural unfolding of each life according to its proper timing. Zen Master Dogen taught, "Time is not separate from you, and as you are present, time does not go away." This teaching points to the profound shift in perspective that comes from accepting our place within time's flow rather than fighting against it. When we stop trying to control or stop time, we become available to the richness available within each moment. Consider your own relationship to the security and prosperity you hope to create for yourself and your loved ones. How much energy do you spend trying to guarantee outcomes that ultimately lie beyond human control? What fears about loss and impermanence drive your planning and accumulation? The Buddha said, "Thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened." happiness never decreases by being shared. This teaching reveals that true prosperity comes not from hoarding resources, but from participating in the natural flow of giving and receiving that characterizes all healthy life. Sengai's teaching about the proper order of death illuminates something profound about intergenerational wisdom and responsibility. Each generation's task is to live fully, contribute meaningfully, and then pass gracefully, making space for the next generation's opportunity to flourish. This natural succession is itself a form of prosperity, the continuation of life through appropriate change, rather than through desperate attempts at preservation. The story also reveals the difference between conventional and ultimate perspectives on family welfare. From a conventional perspective, we want our families to avoid all suffering, loss, and difficulty. From an ultimate perspective, we understand that each person's deepest prosperity comes from learning to find peace within the full spectrum of human experience, including loss and mortality. Real prosperity includes the ability to grieve fully when loss occurs, to appreciate deeply while things are present, and to accept gracefully when it's time to let go. This emotional and spiritual maturity provides far greater security than any amount of material wealth or institutional protection. Tonight, as you reflect on your hopes and fears for yourself and your loved ones, can you distinguish between genuine caring and anxious attachment? What would it look like to wish for your family's real prosperity, their capacity to live fully and depart gracefully, rather than their exemption from the human condition? As the Buddha taught, better than living 100 years without seeing the impermanence of all things is one day of life seeing their impermanence. In accepting this impermanence, we discover the kind of prosperity that cannot be taken away by changing circumstances, the wealth of wisdom that grows through understanding rather than accumulation. Let us conclude our journey with a story that teaches about the profound simplicity that emerges when we stop clinging to complex concerns. This is the teaching of just going to sleep. In the quiet chambers of an ancient temple, where paper screens filtered soft moonlight and the scent of incense lingered in the still air, Master Tekisui lay dying. His body, worn by decades of rigorous practice and selfless teaching, was finally approaching the natural conclusion of its earthly journey. Despite his physical weakness, his mind remained clear and his spirit undisturbed by the approaching transition. For 3 days, his chosen successor Gasan had maintained a constant vigil at his teacher's bedside, providing comfort and attending to practical matters with the devotion that marked their long relationship. The two men had worked together for many years, and Gasan's deep understanding and administrative capabilities had made him the obvious choice to carry on Tekisui's teaching lineage. During this period of transition, Gasan found himself managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously. A fire had recently destroyed one of their temple buildings, and he was actively coordinating the reconstruction efforts while also preparing for his new role as the community's spiritual leader. The convergence of his teacher's approaching death with these practical demands created a complex web of concerns and obligations. As they sat together in the peaceful intimacy of the sick room, Tekisui's curiosity about future plans prompted him to ask about his students' intentions. "Gasan," he said, with the gentle directness that had characterized their relationship, "what are you going to do when you get the temple rebuilt?" Gasan's response reflected both his respect for his teacher and his practical hopes for the community's future. "When your sickness is over, we want you to speak there. to give the inaugural teaching in our new building and bless it with your presence. Despite the kindness of this hope, both men understood the unlikelihood that Tekisui would recover sufficiently to fulfill such a role. The teacher's question probed deeper. Suppose I do not live until then. What will you do if I am no longer available for such ceremonies? Without hesitation, Garson replied with matter-of-fact acceptance. Then we will get someone else to give the inaugural teaching. The community will continue its work regardless of changing circumstances. But Tekisui wasn't finished with his inquiry. He pressed further with another hypothetical scenario. Suppose you cannot find anyone suitable. What if no qualified teacher is available to perform this function? At this point, Gasson's patience with theoretical planning reached its limit. His voice rose with sudden intensity as he responded. Don't ask such foolish questions. Just go to sleep. This seemingly abrupt dismissal actually contained profound teaching about the nature of authentic spiritual priorities and the futility of endless hypothetical worry. In telling his dying teacher to simply sleep, Gassan demonstrated perfect understanding of what the moment actually required. The Buddha proclaimed, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." This teaching illuminates the wisdom underlying Gassan's apparently brusque response, his refusal to engage in elaborate planning for scenarios that might never occur, while neglecting the simple needs of the immediate situation. Why do we become so entangled in hypothetical concerns that we lose contact with present reality? Buddhist analysis reveals several mental patterns that create this disconnection. First is our addiction to mental problem solving and our belief that sufficient planning can guarantee control over future outcomes. We imagine that by considering every possible scenario, we can somehow ensure favorable results. Tekisui's questions, while understandable, reflected this tendency to treat uncertain futures as problems requiring immediate solutions. But Gassan recognized that the most appropriate response to uncertainty is often acceptance, rather than elaborate contingency planning. Second is our difficulty with not knowing and our compulsion to fill every uncertainty with mental activity. We find silence and unknowing uncomfortable, so we generate endless questions and hypothetical scenarios to create the illusion of mental engagement with uncertainty. Third is our tendency to complicate simple situations through excessive analysis. What was actually needed in that moment was rest, peace, and acceptance of approaching death. The questions about future temple activities, while practically relevant, were ultimately irrelevant to the immediate reality of dying. Zen Master Yunmen taught, "Every day is a good day." This doesn't mean that every day is pleasant or easy, but rather that every day offers the opportunity for appropriate response to whatever conditions are actually present. Gassan's teaching demonstrated this principle perfectly. Consider situations in your own life where you become caught in endless loops of hypothetical planning and worry. Perhaps you lie awake at night, imagining various scenarios for upcoming challenges, or spend hours discussing contingency plans for problems that may never materialize. How often does this mental activity actually improve your ability to respond skillfully when situations arise? The Buddha said, "If you want to know your past, look at your present. If you want to know your future, look at your present actions." This teaching points toward the futility of trying to control future outcomes through mental planning while neglecting the quality of presence we bring to current circumstances. Gassan's instruction to just go to sleep represents perfect spiritual direction, the recognition that sometimes the most enlightened action is the simplest one. His teacher needed rest, comfort, and peaceful acceptance of the natural process of dying. All other concerns, however legitimate, were secondary to this immediate reality. The story also reveals something profound about the nature of authentic spiritual succession. Gassan's fitness to carry on his teacher's lineage was demonstrated not through elaborate promises about future activities, but through his capacity to respond appropriately to present needs, without getting lost in hypothetical complications. True spiritual maturity includes the wisdom to know when thinking is helpful and when it becomes an obstacle to appropriate action. Sometimes the most compassionate response is to cut through mental elaboration and return to simple presence with what is actually happening. The phrase, "just go to sleep," also carries deeper symbolic meaning about the spiritual process itself. In Zen understanding, enlightenment often involves a kind of dying to our ordinary consciousness and awakening to our Buddha nature. Tekisui's physical death becomes a metaphor for this deeper letting go of all concerns and identifications. Tonight, as you notice your mind generating endless scenarios about future possibilities and potential problems, can you experiment with Gassan's approach? What would it feel like to simply rest in present awareness rather than trying to solve every hypothetical difficulty through mental activity? As the Buddha taught, peace comes from within, do not seek it without. This inner peace emerges when we stop trying to control the uncontrollable and instead learn to find rest within the natural flow of arising and passing away that characterizes all experience. Sometimes the most profound wisdom is contained in the simplest instruction: just go to sleep. Tonight, as we complete our journey through these timeless teachings, can you feel how the peace you've been seeking has been quietly present all along? Can you sense that the wisdom contained in these ancient stories is not something distant to be acquired, but rather the very awareness that has been listening throughout our time together? As the Buddha taught, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. The profound rest you're experiencing now is not created by these stories, but simply revealed by them, like moonlight uncovering what was always there in the darkness. As we draw our exploration to a close, let us reflect on the profound journey we've shared through 16 remarkable tales, each offering its own unique doorway to understanding. The gates of paradise showed us that heaven and hell exist within our own reactions to life's circumstances. Arresting the Stone Buddha revealed how creative thinking can solve problems that conventional approaches cannot touch. The Soldiers of Humanity taught us about service that transcends national boundaries to embrace all beings. Gudo and the Emperor demonstrated that true wisdom often lies in honest acknowledgement of what we don't know. In the Hands of Destiny revealed how we can accept circumstances while still taking skillful action. The teaching on killing expanded our understanding of harm beyond the physical to include wasting time and teaching without realization. Kassan's sweat showed us the humility required for authentic spiritual authority. Buddha's Zen gave us a glimpse into enlightened perception that sees through all conventional distinctions. The most valuable thing in the world taught us that what cannot be priced is often most precious. Learning to be silent revealed the difference between external quiet and true inner stillness. The Blockhead Lord showed us the value of honest feedback over comfortable flattery. True reformation demonstrated how silent examples can transform others more powerfully than direct confrontation. Show Me Your Temper helped us recognize that we are not identical with our emotional patterns. The Stone Mind revealed the confusion between intellectual concepts and direct experience. Real prosperity taught us what constitutes genuine abundance beyond material accumulation. And finally, Just Go to Sleep reminded us that sometimes the most profound wisdom is the simplest, to rest completely in what is. Each story has been a gentle teacher, showing us different aspects of the same essential truth, that awakening is not a distant goal, but our natural state, temporarily obscured by the very seeking that tries to find it. Like polishing a mirror that was never actually dirty, these teachings simply help us recognize the clarity that has always been present. The Buddha said, "Three things cannot long remain hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth." As you continue on your own path, may the truths illuminated in these stories remain with you, not as concepts to remember, but as invitations to live with greater presence, compassion, and wisdom. May you carry this peace into your dreams and awaken refreshed, knowing that the same awareness that listened to these ancient teachings is the very Buddha nature these masters were pointing toward all along. Thank you for sharing this journey. From all of us at Sleepy Monk, may you rest deeply and walk gently in the light of understanding.